Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him, and suddenly he was wide awake, not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. "Good morning, brother," an annoyingly cheerful voice sounded right on top of him. "Morning, morning, morning." Zorian stared at Curiel in shock, trying to understand what happened. The last thing he remembered was the lich casting that spell at him and Zack, and then blackness. His eyes darted left and right, taking in his surroundings and confirming his suspicions he was in his room, back in Siren. That didn't make any sense, though. He was pleased that he survived the whole experience, but at the very least he expected to wake up in the hospital or something. And Curiel shouldn't be this casual with him after he went through so harrowing an experience. Not even she was this inconsiderate. Besides, this entire scene was eerily familiar. "Kiri." Yes. "What day is it?" Zorian asked, already dreading the answer. "Thursday." He scowled. "I meant date, Kiri. First of Chariot. You're going to the academy today. Don't tell me you forgot," Curiel prodded. Literally she accompanied her words with a well-placed jab at his flank, sticking her bony little index finger in between his ribs. Zorian slapped her hand away, hissing in pain. "I did not forget." Zorian snapped. "I just..." He stopped there. What was he supposed to tell her? Frankly, he had no idea what was going on himself. "You know what?" he said after a moment of silence. "Never mind that, I think it's high time you got off of me." Before Curiel could answer, Zorian unceremoniously flipped her over the edge of the bed before jumping up himself. He snatched his glasses from the set of drawers next to his bed and his eyes swept through his room with more attention to detail this time, seeking anything out of place, anything that might unmask this as a giant, if rather tasteless, prank. While his memory wasn't flawless, he had a habit of arranging his belongings in very specific ways to detect nosy family members rummaging through his belongings. He found nothing massively out of place, so unless his mysterious reenactor knew his system inside and out, unlikely, or Kiri finally decided she'd respect the sanctity of his room while he was away, hell would sooner freeze over. This really was his room like he left it when he went to Scioria. Was it all a dream, then? It seemed altogether too real for a dream. His dreams had always been vague, nonsensical, and prone to evaporate out of his memory soon after he woke up. These felt exactly like his normal memories: no talking birds, floating pyramids, three-eyed wolves and other surreal scenes his dreams usually contained. And there was so much of it, too. Surely a whole month worth of experiences is too much for a mere dream. "Mom wants to talk to you," Curiel told him from the floor, apparently not in any great hurry to get up. "But hey, can you show me some magic before you get down? Please. Pretty please." Zorian frowned. Magic, huh? Come to think of it, he learned quite a bit of magic. Surely if this was all a particularly elaborate dream, all the magic he learned there would be completely bogus, right? He made a couple of sweeping gestures and words before cupping his hands in front of him. A floating orb of light promptly materialized above his palms. "Ha! Not just an elaborate dream, then. That's amazing." Curiel gushed, poking the orb with her finger only to have it pass straight through it. Not surprising, really, since it was just light. She withdrew her finger and curiously stared at it, as if expecting to find it changed somehow. Zorian mentally directed the orb to fly around the room and circle Curiel a few times. Yep, he definitely knew the spell. He retained not just the memory of the casting procedure, but also the fine control he developed with repeated practice with it. You don't get things like that from a mere vision, even a prophetic one. "More. More," demanded Curiel. "Oh come on, Kiri," sighed Zorian. He really wasn't in the mood for her antics at the moment. "I indulged you, didn't I? Go find something else to amuse yourself now." She pouted at him, but he was thoroughly immune to such things by now. Then she frowned for a moment and suddenly straightened as if remembering something. Wait. No. Zorian shouted, but he was already too late. Kiri already ran into the bathroom and slammed the door behind her. Damn it, Kiri, why now? Why not before I woke up? Sucks to be you, she answered. Zorian leaned forward until his forehead collided with the door. I had forewarning and I still fell for it. He frowned. Forewarning, indeed. Whatever his future memories were, they seemed to be fairly reliable. Was Scioria really going to get invaded during the summer festival, then? What should he do about that? What could he do about that? He shook his head and marched back to his room. He would not even contemplate that sort of question until he found out more about what had happened to him. He locked the door so he would have some privacy and sat on his bed. He needed to think. Okay. So he lived through a whole month of school before something happened, and then he woke up in his room back in Siren, as if the entire month never happened. Even with magic factored in, that was preposterous. Time travel was impossible. He didn't have any books in his room that discussed the topic at any appreciable length, but all of the passages that dealt with time travel agreed that it couldn't be done. Even dimensional magic could only warp time, speeding it up or slowing it. It was one of the few things mages agreed was beyond the ability of magic to accomplish. So how, then, was he living through it? He was just in the process of consulting the books in his room for any type of magic that could fake time travel in some way when a knock on his door interrupted his thoughts, and he suddenly realized he was still in his pajamas and that Mother wanted to talk to him quite a while ago. He quickly changed and opened the door, only to find himself under the scrutiny of two women, only one of which was his mother. He almost greeted Ilsa by name, but he caught himself in time. A teacher from the academy has come to talk to you, his mother said, her disapproving stare telling him she was going to give him an earful once Ilsa left. Greetings, Ilsa said. I am Ilsa Zalady, from Scioria's Royal Academy of Magical Arts. I was hoping to speak to you about some matters before you leave. It won't take long. Of course, said Zorian. Where do you? Your room shall suffice, Ilsa said. I'll bring you something to drink, his mother said, excusing herself. Zorian watched Ilsa as she unpacked various papers and placed them on his desk. What was she doing with those, anyway, trying to decide how to proceed with this? If his future memories were valid, she should be handing him the scroll right about. Yeah, there it is. Knowing what's going to happen in advance is weird. For the sake of appearances, Zorian gave the scroll a cursory examination before channeling mana into it. It was exactly how he remembered it, the calligraphy. The flowery official-sounding phrases. The elaborate crest at the bottom of the document, and Zorian felt a wave of dread wash over him. What the hell had he gotten himself involved in? He had no idea what was happening to him. But it was big. Very big. He had the urge to tell Ilsa about his predicament and seek her advice. But he restrained himself. It sounded like the most sensible thing to do. Surely a fully trained mage like her was far more qualified for tackling this than he was, but what could he possibly tell her? That he was remembering things that hadn't happened yet? Yeah. That would go over well. Besides, considering the nature of his future memories, he could easily see himself arrested if a conspiracy to invade Scioria was really discovered thanks to his warnings. After all, it's far more likely his shocking knowledge comes from being a defector of the conspiracy than him being some kind of weird time traveler. An image of a couple of government agents torturing him for information briefly flittered through his mind, and he shuddered. No. Best to keep all this to himself for now. So for the next 10 minutes, Zorian basically reenacted his memories of his initial interaction with Ilsa. Not seeing the point in choosing differently this time, all of his choices were made for reasons that were currently every bit as valid as they were in his future memories. He didn't argue with Ilsa about Svim this time around, though, since he already knew arguing over that topic was pointless. And he didn't request a bathroom break, since he already knew what electives he wished to take. Ilse seemed completely indifferent to his strange decisiveness. Apparently just as eager as he was to get this whole thing out of the way. Then again, why would she be surprised at his decisiveness? She had no future memories to compare this entire encounter to. Unlike him. Hell. She didn't even know him up until now. Zorian sighed and shook his head. They really did feel just like normal memories. And it was hard to ignore them. This is going to be one long month. Are you alright, Mr. Kaczynski? Zorian glanced at Ilse curiously, trying to divine why she asked him that. She glanced towards his hands only for a moment. But Zorian caught it. His hands were shaking. He balled them into fists and took a deep breath. I'm fine, he said. A second or so of uncomfortable silence ensued. Ilse apparently unwilling to continue with her closing speech while she continued to study him. Can I ask you a question? Of course, Ilse said. That's why I'm here. What do you think about time travel? She was clearly taken aback by the question. It was probably the last thing she expected him to ask. Or at least close to the bottom of the list. She composed herself very quickly though. Time travel is impossible, Ilse said firmly. Time can only be dilated or compressed. Never skipped or reversed. Why? Asked Zorian. Honestly curious. He had never actually seen an explanation for the impossibility of time travel. Though that might be because he wasn't terribly interested in the topic up until now. Ilse sighed. I admit I'm not particularly knowledgeable about the details. But our best theories indicate that going against temporal currents is utterly impossible. As in, draw a square circle, impossible. Not, leap over the ocean, impossible. The river of time flows only in one direction. Beyond that, innumerable attempts have been made in recorded past. All ending in failure. She gave him a sharp look. I sincerely hope you won't waste your talents on such a fool's quest. I was just curious, Zorian said defensively. I was just reading a chapter discussing limitations of magic and wondered why the author was so certain time travel is impossible. Well, now you know, Ilse said. Getting up. Now if that's all. I really should be going. I'll be happy to answer any further questions on Monday after class. Have a nice day. Zorian watched her leave and shut the door behind her before collapsing back on his bed. Definitely a long month. For once the train ride didn't put Zorian to sleep. He had subtly prodded Mother with some sensitive topics when she tried to scold him, and he was pretty sure this wasn't some kind of elaborate illusion. Unless the illusionist was aware of some very closely kept family secrets. And he seemed far too lucid for this to be some kind of induced hallucination. As far as he could tell at the moment. He really did travel back in time. He had spent most of the train ride writing down everything of importance he could think of in one of his notebooks. He didn't really think the memories were going to fade any time soon. But it helped him organize his thoughts and notice details he might have otherwise missed. He noted that he forgot to retrieve his books from under Kiri's bed in all the confusion. But decided it didn't matter. If the classes were anything like they were the last time around, he wouldn't need them for the duration of the first month. It was that last spell the Lich performed on him and Zack. Zorian was sure of it. The trouble was, Zorian had no idea what the spell was. Even the words were unfamiliar. Standard incantations used Icosian words as their base. And Zorian knew enough of Icosian to get a general feel of a spell just by listening to what the caster's chanting. But the Lich used a different language for his incantation. Fortunately, Zorian had a really good memory and remembered most of the chant. So he wrote it down in his trusty notebook in phonetic form. He was pretty sure he wouldn't find the spell itself anywhere within his clearance level. as the spell was probably highly restricted and kept out of reach of first circle mages like him. But he would see about identifying the language and finding a proper dictionary in the academy library. The other clue to this whole thing was Zack himself. The boy was capable of fighting a freaking lich. For several minutes before succumbing to it. Even though the lich had been toying with him. It was still pretty impressive. Zorian would put Zack on par with a third circle mage. And probably more. What the hell was that guy doing with academy students then? Something was definitely strange about Zack. Though Zorian had no intention of confronting the guy directly until he found out more about what's going on. For all he knew. It could be one of those, you know about us. So now we have to kill you, sort of things. He would have to tread carefully around the Novita air. Zorian slammed the notebook shut and ran his hand through his hair. No matter how he looked at it. This whole situation seemed utterly crazy. Did he really have memories from the future or was he simply going insane? Both possibilities were terrifying. He was in no way qualified to tackle something like this on his own. But he didn't know how to get other people to help him without being carted off either to a madhouse or an interrogation chamber. He resolved to think about it later. As in, tomorrow later. This whole thing was simply too weird. And he needed to sleep on it before he decides anything. Excuse me. Is this seat free? Zorian glanced at the speaker. Recognizing her after a second of recollection. The nameless green turtleneck girl that joined him in his compartment when they took a stop at Corsa. Of course. The last time she didn't bother to ask for permission before taking a seat. What changed? Ah. It didn't matter. What did matter is that last time she was soon followed by 4 other girls. Very loud. Very obnoxious girls. No way he'd be spending the rest of the train ride listening to their banter again. Yeah, he nodded. In fact. I was just leaving. We're stopping at Corsa. Right? Good day. Miss. And then he quickly grabbed his luggage and went to search for another compartment. Abandoning the girl to her fate. Maybe these future memories are good for something. After all. Bam. Roach. Bam. 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 Roach. Open the thrice damned door. I know you're in here. Zorian rolled over in his bed and groaned. What the hell was Taven doing here this early? No, wait, he snatched the clock from his dresser and brought it in front of his face. She wasn't early. He just slept past noon. Ha. He distinctly remembered going straight to the academy from the train station and falling asleep minutes after reaching his room. Yet he still overslept like this. Apparently dying and then awakening in the past is tiresome business. Bam. 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 I'm coming. I'm coming, shouted Zorian. Stop banging on my door. Already. Naturally. She just kept banging on it with more enthusiasm. Zorian rushed to make himself presentable and stomped towards the door. Wrenching the door open. He gave Taven a withering look. Which she promptly ignored. Finally, she said. What the hell took you so long? I was sleeping, Zorian ground out. Really? Yes, ground out. But dash. I was tired, Zorian snapped. Very tired. And what the hell are you waiting for? Get inside. She rushed inside and Zorian took a moment to collect himself before he confronted her. In his future memories. She never visited him once after he refused to go along with her mission to the sewers. Which spoke volumes about her true feelings about this friendship of theirs. Then again. He hardly even thought about her himself until now. So he probably shouldn't judge. In any case. He was even less inclined to join her on this mission now than he was in his future memories. He actually had more pressing matters to attend to this time. In addition to general apprehensiveness that was still as valid now as it was then. Accordingly, he felt a lot less reluctance in simply blowing her off. And it only took him an hour to convince her to leave him alone. That done, he immediately set out for the library, making a short detour to a nearby bakery for a quick bite to tide him over. Once in the library, he started searching for books on the topic of time travel and trying to identify the language the Lich used in his spell. To call it disappointing would be calling it mildly. For one thing, there were no books on time travel. The topic was not considered a serious field of study. What with it being impossible and all, what little was written about it was scattered across innumerable volumes, hidden in unmarked sections and paragraphs of otherwise unrelated books. Piecing together these scattered mentions was an absolute chore. And not all that rewarding either. None of it was useful in solving the mystery of his future memories. Finding the language the Lich used in his spell was even more frustrating, since he failed to even identify the language, much less translate the chant. He spent the entire weekend fruitlessly sifting through library texts, finally abandoning that avenue of research when it became obvious it wasn't producing any results. Plus, the library workers were starting to give him weird looks at his choice of literature, and he didn't want to create any unfortunate rumors. Hopefully he would be able to trick Zack into revealing what the hell was going on when school started. "You're late." Zorian stared at Akoja's stern face in quiet contemplation. He was glad he wouldn't have to deal with any drama because of his disastrous evening with her, almost as glad as he was about the fact that he wasn't dead, but he couldn't help but wonder what her outburst had been about. She didn't really look like she had a crush on him. So why did his comment hit her so heavily? "What?" she asked. And Zorian realized he had been staring at her a little too long. "Oops. AKO. Why are you telling me this when more than half the class isn't even here yet?" he asked. "Because there is at least a chance you will listen." "Unlike them," Akoja admitted. "Also, someone like you should be an example to other students, not descend to their level." "Someone like me?" inquired Zorian. "Just get inside," she snapped irritably. He sighed and went inside. It was probably for the best to leave things be. He had other problems to deal with. And she was far too rule-bound for his tastes anyway. He didn't know what he was expecting to happen when he walked into the class. Everyone to stop what they were doing and stare at him. Maybe. At least then he would have a reason for feeling so unnerved at attending his first class of the year for the second time. But of course they did no such thing. It wasn't a second time for them. And there was nothing visibly irregular about him for them to take notice. He quashed his unease and sat down in the back of the class, discreetly scanning new arrivals for signs of Zack. He was sure the other boy was connected to this somehow. And the mysterious boy appeared to be Zorian's best chance at understanding what was happening to him. There was a brief commotion when Briam's fire drake familiar hissed up a storm and started chasing Briam's terrified neighbor across the classroom before Briam calmed it down. Apparently the magical reptile liked the unfortunate boy even less than it did Zorian. In any case, Ilsa came in soon after and started the class. Zack never showed up. Zorian spent the entire class in a daze, shocked at this turn of events. Where the hell was Zack? Everything happened almost exactly as it did in his future memories so far, with Zack's absence being the first major deviation. This firmly cemented Zack as somehow connected to this madness. But it also put the boy out of Zorian's reach for the moment. The lecture was even more annoying now than it was the first time he listened to it, since from his perspective he went through these review sessions less than a month ago. Apparently Ilsa worked off some kind of a script, because the lecture was virtually identical to the one from his memory. The only difference being that Zack wasn't there to compete with Akoja for answering Ilsa's questions to the class. Funny how things seem clearer in retrospect. Zack was acting strange right from the start. In that very first lecture. But Zorian thought nothing of it. Sure. Zack volunteering to answer the teacher's questions was out of character for the boy. But not completely implausible. It was just a review session anyway. And they had to know these things to pass the certification. It took 2 weeks before people really began to take notice the extent of Zack's sudden improvement. So many questions. So few answers. He could only hope that Zack would show up soon. Zack didn't come to class that day. Or the next. Or the day after that. By Friday. Zorian was pretty sure the other boy wouldn't be showing up at all. According to Benesek. Zack simply disappeared from his family mansion on the very same day that Zorian took the train to Syoria. And nobody had seen a hint of him ever since. Zorian didn't think he could cook up anything the investigators hired by the boy's guardian hadn't thought of doing. And he didn't want to attract attention to himself by asking around. So he reluctantly put the mystery of Zack aside for the moment. His schoolwork was going well. At least. Thanks to his foreknowledge. He aced Norabul's surprise tests and didn't really have to study for any subject. A small refresher was sufficient to coast him through pretty much anything. Once his warding class really gets going, that's probably going to change. But for now he had all the free time he wanted to deliberate on what he should do about the rapidly approaching summer festival and the accompanying assault. Sadly. With Zack absent. Zorian had hit dead ends in all the clues he had. And was now at loss how to proceed. Come in. Zorian opened the door to Svim's office and defiantly met the man's gaze. He was pretty confident in the accuracy of his future memories by now. Zack's mysterious absence aside. So he knew this was going to be another exercise in frustration. He was tempted to boycott the meetings. But he suspected it was his stoic perseverance in the face of the man's antagonism that eventually convinced Ilsa to take him under her wing. And besides, he felt that he would be doing Svim a favor if he quit. Zorian had a distinct feeling that the man was trying to get him to quit the last time around, and he was far too spiteful to do that. He sat down without prompting. A little disappointed that the man hadn't remarked upon his intentionally rude gesture. Zorian Kaczynski? Svim asked. Zorian nodded and expertly snatched the pen that the man had thrown at him out of the air. Having expected it this time. Show me your basic 3, the man ordered. Not in the least bit surprised at the feat of coordination. Instantly. Without even an extra deep breath. Zorian opened his palm. The pen practically jumping out of his palm and into the air. Make it spin, Svim said. Zorian's eyes widened. What happened to start over? His current attempt wasn't any worse than what he displayed during their last session before that fateful dance. And Svim's only response that night had been start over. Just like any other time. What changed now? Are you having problems with hearing? Svim asked. Make it spin. Zorian blinked. Finally realizing he should be focusing on the current session instead of his memories. What? What do you mean, make it spin? That's not part of the basic 3. Svim sighed dramatically and slowly took another pen and levitated it over his own palm. Instead of just hanging in the air like Zorian's. However, Svim's pen was spinning like a fan. I have no idea how to do that, Zorian admitted. We weren't taught how to do that in classes. Yes. It is criminal how badly the classes are failing our students, Svim said. Such a simple variation of a levitation exercise should not be beyond the grasp of a certified mage. No matter. We shall correct this deficiency before we move on to other matters. Zorian sighed. Great. No wonder no one ever mastered the basic 3 to Svim's liking if the man keeps redefining what mastered means. There were probably hundreds of small variations of each of the basic three. Enough to spend decades learning them all. So little wonder no one could exhaust them all in 2 measly years. Especially considering Svim's standards for labeling the skill mastered. Go on, Svim urged. Start. Zorian focused intensely on the pen hanging above his palm. Trying to figure out how to do that. It should be relatively simple. He just had to affix a stabilization point in the middle of the pen and put pressure on the ends. Right? At least. That's the first thing that popped into his head. He had just managed to get the pen to move a bit when he felt a familiar object impact onto his forehead. Zorian glared at Svim, cursing himself for forgetting about the man's damnable marbles. Svim glanced at the pen that was still hovering over Zorian's palm. You didn't lose focus, Svim remarked. Good. You threw a marble at me, Zorian accused. I was hurrying you up, Svim said. Unrepentant. You're too slow. You must be faster. 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 Start over. Zorian sighed and returned to his task. Yup. Definitely an exercise in frustration. Between his unfamiliarity with the exercise and Svim's constant interruptions, Zorian only managed to get the pen to wobble by the end of the session. Which was a little humiliating. Actually. His above-average shaping skills were one of the few things that set him aside from his fellow mages. And he felt he should have done much better. Despite Svim's repeated sabotage attempts. Fortunately, a book describing the exercise in detail was easy to find in the Academy library. So he would hopefully master it by next week. Well, not master it not in the sense that Svim wanted him to, but he at least wanted to know what he was doing before he tackled his next session with Svim. Of course. Normally he wouldn't be willing to pour that much effort into a lousy shaping exercise. But he needed a distraction. At the beginning, the entire time travel situation was so patently ridiculous that he found it easy to remain calm and collected. Some part of him kept expecting that the whole thing was a double dream or something. And that he would wake up one day and not remember a thing. That part was becoming panicked and agitated now that it became obvious that the situation he faced was real. What the hell was he supposed to do? Zack's mysterious absence weighed heavily upon him, inflaming his paranoia and making him reluctant to tell anyone about the invasion. Zorian was not a fundamentally selfless person and didn't want to save people only to screw himself over in the end. Whatever his future memories really were, they were in essence his second chance at life. He was pretty sure he died at the end of his future memories and he had no intention to squander it. He did consider it his ethical duty to warn people of the danger threatening the city. But there had to be a way to do it without destroying his life or reputation. The simplest idea would be to warn as many people as possible, thus ensuring that at least some of them take the warning seriously, and do so face to face. Since written communications can be ignored in a way that is not really possible in personal interactions. Unfortunately, that would almost certainly paint him as a madman until he's eventually vindicated by the actual assault. If there is an assault. That is, what if the conspirators decide to lay low upon having their plans unmasked and the invasion doesn't happen? What if nobody takes him seriously until it's too late and then decide to turn him into a scapegoat in order to shift responsibility away from themselves? What if one of the people he tries to warn is part of the conspiracy and has him killed before he can tell anyone else? What if? What if way too many what ifs? And he had a sneaking suspicion that one of those what ifs was responsible for Zack's disappearance. As a result of these musings, the idea of staying anonymous appealed to him more and more with each passing day. The problem was that sending a message to a bunch of people without having it traced back to you was not at all simple when magic got involved. Divinations weren't all powerful. But Zorian had only academic understanding of their limitations. And his precautions probably wouldn't hold against a motivated search by a skilled diviner. Zorian sighed. And started outlining a tentative plan into his notebook. Completely ignoring their history teacher's enthusiastic lecture. He had to figure out who to contact. What to put into the letters. And how to ensure they couldn't be traced back to him. He somehow doubted the government would allow authors to publish instructions on how to evade detection from law enforcement. But he would still check the library to see what they have on the topic. He was so caught up in his self-appointed task he barely noticed when the class ended. Furiously scribbling away while everyone else packed and filed out of the classroom. He definitely didn't notice Benasek peering over his shoulder. "What are you doing?" Zorian slammed his notebook shut in a reflexive maneuver as soon as Benasek started talking and gave the other boy a nasty glare. "It's impolite to look over other people's shoulders," Zorian remarked. "Jumpy. Aren't we?" smiled Benasek. Loudly dragging a chair from the nearby table so he could sit on the other side of Zorian's table. "Relax. I didn't see anything." "Not for the lack of trying," remarked Zorian. Benasek only grinned wider. "What do you want?" "Anyway. Just wanted to talk for a bit," Benasek shrugged. "You've been really withdrawn this year. You've got this frustrated look on your face all the time. And you're always busy even though it's the start of the school year. Wanted to know what was bothering you. You know." Zorian sighed. "This isn't something you can help me with." Benasek made a strangled noise. Apparently outraged by his remark. "What do you mean I can't help you? I'll have you know I'm an expert on girl trouble." Now it was Zorian's turn to make a strangled noise. "Girl trouble. Oh come on," Benasek laughed. "Constantly distracted? Spacing out in the middle of the class? Making plans for sending anonymous letters? It's obvious. Man. Who's the lucky girl?" "There is no lucky girl," Zorian growled. "And I thought you didn't see anything." "Listen. I don't think sending anonymous letters is a good idea," Benasek said. Completely ignoring his remarks. "That's so first year. You know. You should just walk up to her and tell her how you feel." "I don't have time for this," Zorian sighed. Getting up from his seat. "Hey. Come on," protested Benasek. Trailing after him. "Man. You're one touchy guy. Did anybody tell you that?" "I was just." Zorian ignored him. He really didn't need this right now. In retrospect, Zorian should have known that simply ignoring Benasek wasn't such a good idea. It only took 2 days for most of the class to know that Zorian has a crush on someone. And their loud speculation was annoying as hell. Not to mention distracting. Still. His displeasure at the rumors evaporated when Nielu approached him one day and gave him a short list of books he might find useful. He had half a mind to set the list on fire. Especially since the list was decorated with dozens of little hearts. But in the end his natural curiosity won over and he went to the library to check them out. He figured that at the very least he'd get a good laugh out of them. He got more than a good laugh. Though instead of silly love advice like he expected. The books Nielu recommended were all about making sure your letters, gifts, and such couldn't be traced back to you with divinations and other magic. Apparently if you call such advice forbidden love, mysteries of scarlet letters revealed and phrase it as relationship advice, you can get straight past the usual censorship such topics would normally be subjected to. Of course. He had no idea how reliable the advice in those books really was. And the librarian looked at him funny when he checked out books like that. But he was still pleased to have found them. If this whole thing worked out in the end he'd have to do something nice for Nielu. So as the summer festival approached, Zorian prepared and plotted. He bought a whole stack of generic paper sheets, pens, and envelopes in one of the stores that looked too poor and disorganized to track their customers' purchases. He worded the letters carefully to avoid revealing any personal details. He made sure not to touch the paper with his bare hands at any point. And that none of his sweat, hair, or blood ended up in the envelope. He deliberately wrote in a blocky, formal script that looked nothing like his normal handwriting. He destroyed the pens, the excess paper, and envelopes he didn't use in the end. And then, a week before the festival, he put the letters in different public postal boxes all over Scioria and waited. It was nerve-wracking, to say the least. Nothing happened, though no one came to confront him about the letters. Which was good. But also nothing out of the ordinary seemed to be happening. Did no one believe him? Did he mess up somehow and the letters ended up not reaching their intended recipients? Are they being so subtle in their reaction that no disturbance is being made? The weight was killing him. Finally, he had enough. On the evening before the dance he decided he'd done everything he could and took the first train out of the city. His letters may or may not have worked. But this way he'll be alright regardless. If anyone asked, though he doubted they would, he'll use his trusty alchemical accident excuse. He messed up a potion and breathed in some hallucinogenic fumes, only coming to his senses when he was already outside of Scioria. Yes. That's exactly what happened. As the train sped away from Scioria in the dead of a night, Zorian suppressed his unease and feelings of guilt for doing so little to warn anyone of the approaching attack. What else could he have done? Nothing. That's what. Nothing at all. After a while he fell into uneasy sleep. The rhythmic thumping of the train his lullaby. Visions of falling stars and skeletons wreathed in green light haunting his dreams. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him. And suddenly he was wide awake. Not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. "Good morning, brother," an annoyingly cheerful voice sounded right on top of him. "Morning. Morning. Morning." Zorian gaped at his little sister incredulously, his mouth opening and closing periodically. "What? Again? Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Zorian growled. And Kyrielle quickly got off of him and scooted away fearfully. Apparently she thought his ire was directed at her. "Not you, Kiri. I just had a nightmare. That's all." He couldn't believe it. It happened again. What the hell? He was glad it happened last time, since it meant he wasn't, dead. But now it was just freaky. Why was this happening to him? Oh. And while he was lamenting his fate internally, Kyrielle barricaded herself in the bathroom again. God damn it all. Zorian stared at the endless fields blurring past him. The silence of the otherwise empty compartment only broken by the rhythmic thumping of the train's machinery. He looked calm and relaxed. But it was only a practiced fa, aude and nothing more. His mask of stoicism might have seemed silly, as there was no one around to judge him. But over the years Zorian had found that acting calm on the outside helped him achieve calm more easily on the inside as well. He needed any help he could get in achieving inner peace now, because he was about to start panicking like a headless chicken. Why was this happening again? The first time it had happened, he was dead sure the Lich was responsible. The spell had hit him. And then he woke up in the past. Cause and effect. He hadn't been hit by some mysterious spell this time. Though not unless someone had snuck into the train compartment while he was sleeping, which he found very unlikely. No. He had just dozed off and woke up in the past again. As if it was the most normal thing in the world. Then again, it did highlight some things that had been bothering him until now. After all, Why had the Lich cast a time travel spell on him? It seemed rather counterproductive to the whole secret invasion plot. Time travel seemed too purposeful and complex to be an accidental side effect. And he seriously doubted the Lich had used a spell whose effects it did not understand. Even a neophyte like him knew what a horrible idea it was to use a spell you don't understand in an uncontrolled environment. And the undead spellcaster wouldn't have reached the level it did if it was willing to do something so foolish for the sake of a couple of brats it had already defeated anyway. No. There was a simpler explanation: the Lich wasn't responsible for his time-traveling problems. It really had been trying to kill them. Them. Plural. Because Zack had also been the target. The same Zack that had been shockingly good in all his classes all of a sudden. The same Zack that was wandering around the city armed to the teeth with combat magic that should be beyond any academy student. The same Zack that had been making very curious offhand comments all month long. Perhaps it was Zack, not the Lich, who had cast the time travel spell. Zack being a time traveler would explain his vast abilities and inexplicable academic improvement quite nicely. Since this particular method of time travel seems to just send a person's mind into their younger body. He could be of an arbitrarily large age. And what Zorian remembered of Zack's various comments led him to believe the boy had lived through this particular time period many times over. A mage with decades of experience and detailed foreknowledge would no doubt find third-year curriculum laughably easy. Though even if Zack had been the one to cast the time travel spell, there was still left the question of why Zorian was thrown back too. It could have easily been an accident, he knew that grabbing a mage while they're in the process of casting a teleport spell could pull you along for the ride. And they were basically tangled with one another, but that didn't explain why Zorian was repeating this month for the second time. Zack had been absent all month long, and thus hadn't had the opportunity to cast anything at Zorian. He didn't know what to think. Hopefully Zack would be present for questioning this time around. Now stopping in Corsa, a disembodied voice echoed. The faulty speakers crackling with signal noise every once in a while. I repeat. Now stopping in Corsa. Thank you. What? Already? A glance through the window revealed the familiar white tablet confirming his arrival at the trading hub. He was half tempted to get off the train and spend the entire month fooling around and trying to forget this whole time travel business. But quickly dismissed it. Blowing off the beginning of the school year like that would be really irresponsible and self-destructive. Even if going through another identical month of classes was anything but appealing. There was a possibility that he would be flung back into the past for the third time. Of course. But that wasn't something he should be relying on. There was no way the spell could keep sending him back indefinitely. After all, it was bound to run out of mana sooner or later. Probably sooner. Since time travel must be pretty high level. Right? Zorian snapped out of his thoughts and finally noticed the boy peering into his compartment. He frowned. He specifically chose this compartment because it was completely empty during his second attempt at life. After he had left the green turtleneck girl to her giggling fate. He had come here for some peace. So this time he decided to be proactive and went here right from the start. Apparently it wasn't that simple. He supposed that his very presence attracted the boy. Some people just plain liked company. And would avoid empty compartments. Yes. Zorian said politely. Hoping the boy just wanted to ask him something instead of trying to find a seat. He was mistaken. Do you mind if I sit here? No. Go right ahead, said Zorian. Giving the boy a forced smile. Damn. The boy smiled brightly at him. And quickly dragged his luggage in. A lot of luggage. First year. Right? Zorian asked. Unable to help himself. So much for his plan on remaining silent and creeping the boy out into leaving the compartment. Oh well. Yeah, the boy agreed. How did you know? Your luggage, Zorian remarked. You do realize the academy grounds are pretty far from the main station? Your arms are going to fall off by the time you get there. The boy blinked. Apparently he didn't know. It's really not that bad. Right? Zorian shrugged. You better hope it doesn't rain. Haha, the boy laughed nervously. I'm sure I'm not that unlucky. Zorian smirked. Ah. The benefits of foresight. Or was it hindsight? Language really wasn't designed with the possibility of time travel in mind. Ah. I didn't introduce myself. The boy suddenly blurted out. I'm Björn Ivarin. Zorian Kaczynski. The boy's eyes lit up immediately. Like Dash. Like Diamond Kaczynski. Yes, Zorian said. Suddenly finding the window incredibly interesting. The boy stared at him expectantly. But if he had expected further elaboration from Zorian on the subject, he was about to be sorely disappointed. The last thing Zorian wanted to do was talk about his eldest brother. So, are you related to Diamond Kaczynski or is your last name just a coincidence? Asked the boy after a lengthy pause. Zorian pretended he couldn't hear him. And instead retrieved his notebook from the neighboring seat and studied it intently. It was almost completely empty. Since all his previous notes about the invasion and the mystery of his future memories were now gone. Lost in a future he left behind him. It wasn't much of a loss. Since the vast majority of those notes had been worthless hollow speculations and dead-end leads that hadn't got him any closer to solving this mystery. Still, he had written down a few things he remembered from his previous notes. Like the spell chant the Lich had uttered before killing him. Yes. Zack was likely responsible for all of this. But he couldn't be sure. After judging the silence to have lasted for a fittingly awkward amount of time, Zorian looked up from his notebook to fixate a look of confusion at the waiting boy. Huh? Did you say something? Zorian pretended. Frowning slightly as if he honestly hadn't heard a word of the question he was asked. Air. Never mind, the boy backpedaled. It's not important. Zorian gave the boy a genuine smile. At least he could take a hint. He talked to the boy for a while. Mostly just answering the boy's questions about first-year curriculum. Before growing bored with it and starting to feign interest in his notebook again. Hoping he will take the hint. What's so interesting about that notebook? Anyway? He asked. Either oblivious to Zorian's disinterest in continued conversation or deliberately ignoring it. Don't tell me you're studying already. No. These are just notes on some personal research, said Zorian. It's not going too well, so I'm a little frustrated with it. My mind keeps drifting to it. Especially when the alternative was talking to an overly inquisitive first year. The academy library dash. First thing I tried, Zorian sighed. I'm not stupid. You know. The boy rolled his eyes at him. Did you search for the books yourself or did you ask the librarian to help you? Mother works as a librarian. And they have these special divination spells that let them find things in minutes that would take you decades if you search by title and skimming alone. Zorian opened his mouth before closing it. Ask the librarian for help. Huh. Okay. Maybe he is stupid. Well, it's not really a topic I want to bother the librarian with, Zorian tried. Which was true. But he knew he'd end up trying it anyway. Maybe I could find the spells themselves in the spell repository. But no. If they are anything like other divination spells, it's using them correctly and interpreting the results that's the problem. Not casting them. You could always get a job in the library, the boy offered. If the academy library is anything like the one my mother works in, they're always desperate for help. They teach their employees how to use those spells as a matter of course. Really? Zorian asked. rather intrigued by the idea. "It's worth a try," he said, shrugging. For the rest of the ride, Zorian stopped trying to evade conversation. Byrne had definitely earned some respect from him. "Of course. We're always looking for help." "Well, that was easy. We can't pay you much. Understand that miserable gnome of a headmaster cut our budget again. But we're very flexible about work time and we've got a pretty friendly atmosphere here." Zorian waited patiently for the librarian to run out of steam. She was an unassuming middle-aged woman at first glance. But the moment she had begun speaking he realized her looks were rather deceiving. She was cheerful and had a sort of indescribable energy about her. Just standing around her made Zorian feel the same sort of pressure he felt when stuck in a crowd of people. And he had to rein in his instinct to step back as if from a raging fire. "I'm guessing you don't get many work offers." "Then?" Zorian tried. "Why is that? Shouldn't people be fighting tooth and nail to work in a place like this? It's a pretty famous library." She snorted. And Zorian could swear he could feel the derision and a touch of bitterness in the seemingly innocuous sound. "Academy regulations require us to only hire employees that are first circle mages or higher. Most graduates have better paying, more glamorous options than this." She waved her hand towards rows or bookshelves around them. "Reducing us to hiring students." "Who are?" She suddenly stopped and blinked, as if remembering something. "But anyway. Enough of that," she said, clapping her hands and beaming at him. "From this day on, you're one of the library assistants. Congratulations. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them." It was only through superhuman willpower that Zorian stopped himself from rolling his eyes at her. He never agreed to anything. Merely inquired about the possibility of employment, and she undoubtedly knew that. But oh well. He did want the job. And not just because he was hoping to learn some nifty new spells and translate the Lich's chant. He suspected that library employees got to access parts of the library that would normally be restricted to him as a first circle mage. And that was just too much of a temptation to pass up. "Question 1, said Zorian. "How often do I come to work?" She blinked, surprised for a moment. No doubt she expected him to protest her presumptuousness. "Well, when can you come?" "Between the classes. And the need for study time and other commitments. Most of our student employees work once or twice a week." "How much time can you set aside for this?" "The classes are pretty easy at this point," Zorian said. "We're mostly doing the review of our second year, which I know like the back of my hand. Setting aside one day for unexpected developments. I could be here 4 times a week. My weekends are mostly free too. If you need any help then." Zorian mentally berated himself for talking like that. The classes hadn't even started yet. So how would he know what they consisted of? Luckily, the librarian didn't call him out on it. Instead, her eyes immediately lit up upon hearing this, and she started shouting. "Ibury," she called out. "I've got a new partner for you." A bespectacled girl carrying an armload of books popped out of the small room adjacent to the information desk to see what was going on. Oh. It was the green turtleneck girl. She was wearing it even now, that he shared a compartment with. Except he had chosen a seat on the other side of the train this time. So they never met on the train. Oh well. Probably wouldn't have mattered anyway. Anyway. "I believe some introductions are in order," the librarian said. "I am Kirathishli Korisova. One of the few actual librarians in this place. This pretty lady," she gestured towards the turtleneck girl, who blushed at the praise and shifted uncomfortably, clutching the stack of books tighter in her arms, "is our resident busy little bee. Ibury Ambercombe. Ibury has been working here since last year. And I don't know what I'd do without her. Ibury. This is Zorian Kaczynski. The girls suddenly perked up at this. Kaczynski. As in. Younger brother of Daimen Kaczynski, Zorian said. Unable to suppress a small sigh. Actually. I'm pretty sure she meant your other brother, Kirathishli said with a sly smile. She's in class with Fortov and has a bit of a crush. She and a dozen other girls. Fortov never had a shortage of women throwing themselves at him. Miss Korisova. Ivory protested. Oh. Lighten up, Kirathishli said. Anyway. Zorian here will be working with us pretty heavily for the foreseeable future. Go show him what to do. And just like that. He was employed at the library. Only time would tell if he was wasting his time. Much like the last time. Zack hadn't come to class. Zorian was half expecting it. But it was no less annoying because of it. It cemented Zorian's suspicion that Zack was heavily involved in this mess. But the boy's absence made it impossible for Zorian to confront him about it. What was he supposed to do now? For that matter. Was he supposed to do anything at all? Last time he had been operating on the belief that if he didn't do something about the invasion, no one would. No one else had the strange future memories he did. After all, if his speculations were correct. Though. Zack had probably traveled through time specifically to stop the invasion. What other reason did he have to frequent this particular time period? Besides, he had been wandering the city during the attack. Picking off attackers. So all in all, there just might be an experienced time-traveling mage on the job already. And he would only get in the way. The problem with that idea was that he was ultimately just guessing. And had no idea if it was true or not. He could be dooming himself and the city through inaction. Relying on a boy who, quite frankly, didn't inspire too much confidence in him. Zack reminded him of his brothers a little too much. And besides, didn't Zack lose against the Lich? Yeah. Not knowing how to unravel the mystery presented to him. Or even where to start. Zorian had thrown himself into schoolwork and his job at the library. Of course. Thanks to going through this for the third time. The only issue he had with schoolwork was Svim's grating insistence that his grasp on the pen spinning, as Zorian affectionately called it, exercise was abominable and that he had to do it over and over and over again. His time at the library, on the other hand, was interesting. Though not really in the way he hoped it would be. He hadn't learned any spells yet. Though he suspected this was because there were so many other, more pressing things he had to learn before Kirathishli and Ivory decided to invest that kind of effort in him. Simply put, he wasn't very good at his job. The seemingly simple job of shuffling some books around was made immensely more complicated by the various library protocols and the all-important book classification scheme. Zorian had hoped to demonstrate basic proficiency with his duties before asking for favors. But it had been 2 weeks and he was beginning to understand that it would take him at least a couple of months to reach that level. And he didn't have that. The summer festival was getting closer. That's why he proceeded to corner Kirathishli after she had dismissed him for the day to ask her about the coveted book divinations. Ivory lingered, pretending to be busy so she could eavesdrop. She sure was nosy for such a shy girl. Say. I've been meaning to ask a small favor of you, Zorian began. Go ahead, Kirathishli said. You've helped us a lot. So I'll be happy to help if I can. It's not often we get such a competent worker. Balked Zorian. Competent? I barely know what I'm doing. If it weren't for your and Ivory's help I would wander around like a headless chicken. That's why I paired you with Ivory to learn. And boy are you learning fast. Faster than I did when I first started at this job. That's for sure. To be honest, I usually give only the simplest and most tedious jobs to student employees. But since you're more dedicated than them, I've given you the advanced course. Ah, Zorian said after a short silence. I'm flattered. And he really was. Anyway. I was wondering about bookfinding divinations. I've been searching for a pretty obscure topic and I'm not going anywhere with it. Ah. Kirathishli said. Slapping her forehead. How could I forget about that? Of course I'll teach you. We teach all our long-term workers those. They're a bit tricky to use. Though. So it will take a while to learn how to use them properly. Ivory will show you how. Though you can always tell me what exactly you're looking for and I'll do my best to help you out. I know this library like the back of my hand. You know. Zorian debated the merit of showing her the Lich's chant. Since he suspected it was something that could get him into a lot of trouble just for asking about it. But saw no other way. No doubt learning how to use those divinations took months he didn't have. He took out his notebook and ripped out the corresponding page. Handing it to her. Kirathishli arched her eyebrow at the text. And Ivory gave up on all pretenses of not paying attention and peered over her shoulder to see what was on the slip of paper. It's an unknown language, Zorian clarified. I don't even know which one. Really? Tricky, Kirathishli remarked. Finding a written reference based on a phonetic pronunciation of a word you don't even understand is a tall order. Even with divinations. You should just find an expert in languages to help you if it's so important. You should try Xenomir, piped in Ivory. Our history teacher, asked Zorian incredulously. He also teaches linguistics, Ivory said. He's a polyglot. Speaks 37 languages. Whoa. Yeah, Ivory agreed. He should at least know what language that is. Even if he can't read it. He's pretty helpful if you approach him nicely. I doubt he'll turn you away. Interesting. Ah. Mr. Kaczynski. What can I do for you? Xenomir Algai was old. Really old. He wore blue robes, actual robes. Like the Magi of old, and had a carefully sculpted white beard. Despite his advanced age. He moved with a spring in his step and his eyes had sharpness that most people half his age lacked. Zorian hadn't taken the linguistics elective. But he knew from his history class that Xenomir cared about his subject almost as much as Nora Boole did about runes and mathematics, though he at least understood that most students didn't share his passion for the subject. I was told you can help me with some translation, Zorian said. I have a pretty fragmentary recording of an unknown language in phonetic form. And I was hoping you could at least tell me what kind of language it is. It's nothing like any language I've encountered so far. Xenomir perked up at the notion of an unknown language and gingerly took the paper slip with the Lich's chant from Zorian's hand. His eyes widened barely a second afterward. Where did you get this? He asked quietly. Zorian debated internally what to do and then settled for a measure of truth. I was attacked by someone a while ago. They used a spell with that chant as the incantation. I just wanted to know what it does. Xenomir took a deep breath and leaned back. You're lucky it didn't hit. It's some kind of soul magic spell. Soul magic? Necromancy, clarified Xenomir. Zorian blinked. Necromancy? Well. It sort of made sense for the Lich to use that sort of spells. But what did necromancy have to do with time travel? Nothing. This was pretty much a definite confirmation of Zack as a primary cause of his predicament. So. Wait. What is that language anyway? Asked Zorian. Oh. Yes. The language, it's old Majera language. Spoken by many of the cultures that shared the continent of Mycena with Icosians before their rise to prominence. Many of the ruins in Koth are written in it and, sadly, it is the language in which many of the blackest rituals and necromantic spells are formulated. You won't find any books about it available in public circulations. I'm afraid. But let's return to the matter of this assailant. This is the darkest of magic they used. And they can be up to no good if they're throwing spells like that on academy students. Deciding he couldn't just backpedal now, Zorian nonetheless decided against mentioning time travel in any way and settled for making something up. He told Xenomir about him overhearing a plan to invade the city during the summer festival. At first he dismissed it as some kind of prank because of its ludicrous nature. But when the two cloaked figures noticed him eavesdropping and started throwing spells he didn't recognize at him, he grew concerned. Xenomir took him a lot more seriously than Zorian thought he would, and told him to go home and leave everything up to him from now on. That went surprisingly well. At least Xenomir hadn't dragged him off to the police station to give a statement right away, though he suspected something like that might be in his near future. He paced nervously around in his room, unable to sleep and steadily losing the fight to keep his growing apprehension in check. Smart or not, the deed was done. And now the only thing he could do was wait and see what the consequences of his decision would be. For him and for everyone. A knock on the door interrupted him. Strong, confident knocking that nonetheless only lasted for a second or two, completely unlike the knocking of anyone he knew. Coming, Zorian called out, suspecting it was someone coming to talk to him about the story he told Xenomir. What can I, Irk? Zorian stared dumbly at the blade sticking out of his chest, his mouth opening in an unvoiced scream. He had just enough time to look at his assailant, a short figure dressed in loose black clothes and a faceless white mask, before the blade was painfully wrenched out of his body and then immediately inserted again into his chest cavity. Again and again and again. When darkness consumed his vision, he was actually glad he was dying. Being repeatedly stabbed in the chest hurts. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him. And suddenly he was wide awake. Not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. Good M-. Kiriel was cut off as Zorian shot upright, eyes wide in fright, gasping for breath. He was killed. They killed him. He told someone about the attack and he was killed that very evening. How the hell had they even found out that fast? Was Xenomir in on the attack, or were they just that well informed? Nightmare? Kiriel asked. Zorian breathed deeply, ignoring the phantom pain in his chest as he did so. Yeah. Definitely a nightmare. Zorian knew he should focus on what Ilsa was saying. But for the life of him his mind wouldn't stop dwelling on what had happened. In retrospect, he shouldn't be so surprised at that particular turn of events. An invasion of that scale cannot be kept secret without some hefty inside help. So of course they'd find out about anyone raising an alarm about them. And besides, if stopping the invasion had as simple a solution as notifying the law enforcement, surely Zack would have already done it, and Zorian wouldn't be repeating this month for the third time. Although he was starting to develop a healthy dose of respect for these restarts. This was the second time he died, and he only went through this month thrice. He seemed prone to dying. Didn't Zack say something about him always getting blown up in that initial barrage unless he did something about it? He snapped back into the real world when he realized Ilsa had stopped talking and was looking at him intently. He gave her a questioning look. "Are you quite all right?" she asked. And Zorian noticed her glancing at his hands. Why would she? Oh. His hands were shaking. He was probably quite pale too, if the skin on his hands was of any indication. He rubbed his hands together a few times and then balled them up into fists to reassert control over them. "Not quite," Zorian admitted. "But I will be. You don't have to worry about it." She stared at him for a second longer and then nodded. "Very well," she said. "Do you want me to teleport you to the academy? I can't imagine riding the train in the state you're in is going to be very pleasant for you." Zorian blinked. At loss what to say. He disdained train travel at the best of times. So an offer like this was a godsend at the moment. But why? I don't want to inconvenience you, he tried. Don't worry. I was going there anyway, she said. It's the least I could do for getting to you so late and taking the choice of your mentor away from you. Well. That much was true. Svim really was a horrible, useless mentor. Zorian excused himself to tell Mother he was leaving, which took way too long in his opinion. Since Mother wouldn't stop bombarding him with questions about teleportation. Suddenly concerned about his safety before picking up his luggage and following Ilse outside. He was actually a little excited. Since he'd never teleported before. He'd have been even more excited. But the memory of being stabbed to death was still uncomfortably fresh, dampening his enthusiasm somewhat. Ready? She asked. He nodded. Don't worry. The rumors about the dangers of teleporting are mostly exaggerated, Ilse said. You can't get stuck inside solid objects, the spell doesn't work that way, and if something goes wrong I'll immediately know it and collapse the spell before dimensional ripples tear us apart. Zorian scowled. He already knew that. But saw no point in pointing that out. She obviously heard his little exchange with Mother. Ilse started chanting and Zorian stood straighter. Not wanting to miss. The world rippled. Then changed. Suddenly they were both standing in a well-lit circular room. A large magical circle carved into the marble floor they stood on. There was no disorientation. No flash of colors. No nothing, almost disappointing. He studied the room they were in a little more closely. Trying to understand where they were. This is the teleport redirection point, Ilse said. The Academy wards shunt every incoming teleport into this place for security reasons. Of course. That's assuming you're properly keyed in and have sufficient authorization to teleport in at all. She fixed him with a penetrating gaze. Teleporting into a warded space is just one of the many dangers of the spell. Don't experiment with it on your own. I'm pretty sure teleport is far above my access level, pointed out Zorian. She shrugged. Some students are capable of reconstructing a spell after seeing it performed only once. Once you know the chant and gestures. 80% of the work has already been done for you. Zorian blinked. Now why didn't he think of that? Would you mind casting that spell one more time? He asked innocently. Strictly for academic purposes. You see. She chuckled. No. If it makes you feel any better. I doubt you have enough mana reserves to cast the spell even once. As a point of fact. It didn't make him feel any better. He didn't care how dangerous it was. He'd learn the teleport spell as soon as he was able. He just shaved off an entire day of train travel from his journey in an instant. The ability to do that kind of thing at will would be worth quite a lot of trouble to acquire. He let out a sigh and left Ilse to her own devices to get settled in. I could get used to this kind of travel, Zorian mumbled to himself as he unlocked the door to his room and dropped his luggage to the floor in relief. Too bad I could never fake distress convincingly enough. Or else I'd convince Ilse to take me along at the beginning of every restart. He froze mid-step. He shouldn't be thinking like that. That was dangerous thinking. He had no proof that the restarts would keep happening indefinitely. In fact, everything he knew about magic told him it couldn't be true. Whatever spell had been put on him was going to run out of mana at some point, and then there'd be no restart. No second chances, no return from the dead. He had to treat every restart as if it were his last. Because it might very well be. Though he had to admit that. Despite it ending with him getting stabbed to death. The previous restart wasn't a complete disaster. At least he had all but confirmed it was Zack. And not the Lich. That was responsible for this. Instead of researching unknown languages and time travel. It would probably be wiser to find out where Zack keeps disappearing to every time. But not right now. He deserved a little rest after being brought back from the dead. He really should have known it wouldn't be that easy. The moment he tried to track down Zack, he was reminded of why he didn't do that in his very first restart. Zack was not only an heir of noble House Novita, he was the only still living member of that house. The rest of his family having been killed in the Splinter Wars. Zack stood to inherit a sizable financial empire and a legacy of several generations of mages once he came of age. So everything about him was scrutinized closely by a great number of interested parties. Consequently, his disappearance was a big deal. And a lot of people wanted to know where he went. Zorian was just one of these people. And if those people, and the people they hired, hadn't managed to track him down, he had very little chance to do so. Needless to say, he didn't get anywhere. Like he suspected. The two girls Zack hung out with during Zorian's original month were nothing special without the Novita heir there to help them out and hang out with them, and asking people about them led to some pretty annoying rumors being spread around, honestly. Can't a guy ask about a girl without everyone assuming he's got a romantic interest in her? His house was sealed with some pretty heavy ward work. His legal guardian could not be reached. And if he had any close friends, they weren't among his classmates. Zorian wasn't a detective. And had no idea what else to look for. And considering that many professional detectives had already failed, and continued to fail, to track the boy down, he suspected it wouldn't help even if he did know a thing or two about tracking people down. A month went by with little to show for it. Summer festival came. And Zorian once again boarded a train out of Scioria. Awake and alert as the night deepened and minutes ticked away. He brought a pocket watch with him this time. And kept glancing at it every once in a while. Silently praying that he wouldn't have to start over once again, but wanting to know exactly when he got thrown back in case he did. Sure enough, his prayers wouldn't be answered. Somewhere around 2 past midnight he blacked out and woke up with Kiri on top of him, wishing him a good morning. He probably should have admitted it to himself right then and there. He was a fairly smart person, after all, and not prone to deluding himself. Instead, it took 4 more restarts before he accepted the truth of his predicament. He was stuck in some kind of a time loop. And it wasn't going to end any time soon. He didn't know how it was possible. Maybe the spell was powered by Zack's seemingly inexhaustible mana reserves instead of being limited to a fixed amount at the moment of casting. Maybe it was one of those rare self-sustaining spells. Hell, maybe it reached into the heart of the world and drew power from the world dragon itself. It didn't really matter how it did it. Only that it did. But that's retrospect. At the time he just refused to accept it. And instead tried to live like he normally would. It was rather boring. Yes. But what if this particular restart was the one where it ended? The restart where the consequences of his choices would not magically disappear at 2 past midnight on the night of the festival. He checked, and yes. It was consistent across all 4 restarts. He was through with that though. He couldn't go on like this. Excluding the invasion bit. The month had been a bore even the first time around. And he had lived through it 8 times already. He knew the first month curriculum well enough by now to get near perfect scores in all subjects. Even warding. It had little effect on how people treated him. As he found out, he was known to be capable. And his grades had always been very good. So people weren't really surprised if he aced all the exams or effortlessly performed a perfect magic missile on their very first combat magic class. It was within the realm of people's expectations. Unlike Zack's sudden improvement. The only people whose behavior changed in response to his improvement were Akoja and Svim. Akoja had gotten twice as annoying now that she apparently found a kindred soul. Always insisting that they check each other's work and asking him for help whenever she didn't understand something. Zorian had thought she'd be green with jealousy that he was beating her scores. But it seemed she was a lot less bothered to be outdone by him. as opposed to by the likes of Zack and Nielu. Svim took his superb scores as an indication that he should be held to an even higher standard. As such, not only did he not declare his pen spinning good enough to move on to something else, he had demoted him back to the regular levitation exercise. In all honesty, Zorian wasn't terribly bothered by that even if he did master the pen spinning exercise to Svim's satisfaction. No doubt he'd get nothing more than another minor variation of the basic 3 to practice. So all in all, going through another boring month like that was out of the question. He took different electives, this time astronomy, architecture, and geography of the global mana flow, and he fully intended to bring down his academic scores back to normal so Svim and Akoja would remain their normal, more tolerable selves. He also intended to skip quite a few time-consuming homework projects to focus on his own personal studies. And he was going to spend a sizable portion of his savings on alchemical supplies. Should this restart be the final one, he was going to be seriously inconvenienced. But it wouldn't be the end of the world. And he suspected the disruptions following in the wake of the invasion would render many of the normal concerns moot. Then he walked into the Essential Invocations classroom on the first day of school and realized his plans would have to be adjusted. Zack was finally back in class. At first, Zorian hadn't even noticed him. That was noteworthy by itself, as Zack wasn't an easy person to overlook. The boy loved attention and seemed to have trouble staying still and quiet. Something that remained consistent even after Zack suddenly turned into some kind of a weirdo time traveler. Today, however, the normally loud and exuberant boy remained eerily silent. He also eschewed his typical tactic of sitting in the back of the classroom to occupy a seat near the front. If his out-of-character behavior hadn't caused people to glance at him a bit too often, Zorian would have probably overlooked him. He was so shocked to see the boy finally present in class that he momentarily halted in his tracks, standing like an idiot in the middle of the classroom. Then, after a moment's thought, he set off towards the likely cause of his predicament. His first instinct was to immediately march up to the boy and drag him away into some forgotten corner to clear everything up. But Zack's subdued appearance gave him pause. Zack's skin was pale and bloodless, and he was breathing a little too quickly and shallowly for a healthy person. He looked sick. Thinking about it a little more carefully, approaching the boy so directly would be a reckless and possibly dangerous course of action. His loss to the Lich aside, Zack was vastly more powerful than Zorian. And Zorian had no idea how the other boy would react if he knew there was another person tagging along in his time-traveling adventure. He'd need to confront him sooner or later, though. So he fully intended to make at least tentative contact with the boy. He scanned the front of the classroom, looking for a free seat near Zack that would allow him to study the boy during the lecture. He didn't have to look hard. Zack was sitting very close to Brian, and every seat around Brian was empty. The cause was easy to divine: people were reluctant to get close to the angry-looking fire drake he was holding. As someone with future knowledge, Zorian knew their fears were well-founded. While the young fire drake didn't torch anyone, and sometimes Zorian wondered how much of that was thanks to the drake's youth and lack of ability. As opposed to having self-restraint, it didn't hesitate to bite and scratch. And it was hard to tell what would set it off. Fortunately, it seemed to tolerate Zorian better than most people. So he simply plopped down into the seat next to Brian, silencing the lizard's hissing with an annoyed glare. He stared at the fire drake's slitted yellow eyes until the reptile turned its head and left him alone. "Wow. You shut him down in an instant," remarked Brian. "I wish I could control him that easily." The fire drake snapped its jaws at the air in front of Brian's face, causing the boy to flinch back. Brian huffed in annoyance and apparently let the matter drop. Not for the first time. Zorian wondered just how smart that creature really was. Then, doing his best to appear natural. Zorian turned to Zack sitting a bit further away from him. "You look like hell," Zorian remarked. Zack groaned and buried his face into his hands. "I feel like hell," he moaned. "What did that pile of bones do to me?" Zorian's heart quickened. Zack no doubt expected his comment to be disregarded as a weird metaphor. But to Zorian it was definite confirmation that Zack was also a time traveler. No points for guessing who or what the mysterious pile of bones was. Now how could he get Zack to talk more without revealing that he knew more than he should? "Pile of bones?" Zorian asked, his voice curious. Zack opened his mouth to respond, but Ilsa chose that exact moment to walk into the classroom and Zack dropped the issue. Zorian had to restrain himself from glaring at Ilsa as she smiled at him. Couldn't she have waited a few more minutes? Ignorant and uncaring of Zorian's internal grumbling, Ilsa accepted the list of present students from Akoja and began introducing herself and her class. It wasn't anything that Zorian hadn't heard 8 times already. So he mostly ignored her in favor of keeping an eye on Zack and plotting how to extract time travel-related information out of him. Suddenly he realized that Ilsa had stopped talking and was looking in his direction. After a few moments he realized she was looking at Zack. "Mr. Novita. You look quite ill. Please tell me you didn't come to my class with a hangover." The class erupted into laughter and Zack winced. Either because loud noises bothered him in the state he was in or because he noticed the undercurrent of agitation in Ilsa's question. Either way he recovered quickly. "It's not a hangover," protested Zack. "I just woke up like this. I swear." "And you thought that coming to class like this was a good idea? Why?" Ilsa prodded. I honestly didn't think it would last this long. I figured it would pass in an hour or 2, said Zack sheepishly. Zorian frowned. If the sickness was a consequence of the spell the Lich had targeted them with that evening, and Zack certainly seemed to think so. If his previous comment was any indication, that would mean Zack had been suffering its effects for the past 8 months or so. As Zack had been absent for that long, why would Zack expect a condition that serious to pass in an hour or 2? Why couldn't there be any simple answers in all this? Well, it didn't, Ilsa concluded. While I appreciate your dedication to your studies, Zorian distinctly heard AKO snorting derisively in the background. I must insist you go home or, better yet, visit a healer. You look like you're going to collapse any moment. Before Zack could say anything, Zorian rose from his seat. I'll get him home. Teacher, he said. Zack gave him a surprised look. But Ilsa just nodded and shooed them away. Zorian picked up his bag and left with Zack in tow. Very pleased with himself. He got a legitimate excuse to talk. Important, Zack mumbled. He took a deep breath and fixed Zorian with a speculative look. Hey. Want to go to the cafeteria and grab something to eat? You think your stomach can handle it? Zorian asked. You bet, Zack nodded. I'm starving. Zorian shrugged and gestured for Zack to lead the way. That was how Zorian found himself sharing a table with the cause of his time-traveling problems. Trying to think of a good opening for a conversation he wanted to have with the boy. Or should he wait for a few days to make Zack get used to his presence? You know. I find this whole situation very amusing, Zack said between mouthfuls. Shoveling noodles into his mouth and attempting to talk at the same time. Now that was very amusing. His mother always insisted he should aspire to behave like a noble. She would have a heart attack if he ever adopted Zack's eating manners. A good little student like you. Skipping class to have lunch with a class delinquent, what is the world coming to? What would your mother say if she saw you now? First of all, I'm not skipping class, I'm escorting you home, Zorian pointed out. Ignoring a snort from Zack. We just stopped for a meal so you wouldn't collapse from starvation before we get there. Another snort. And my mother would go all sparkly-eyed at who I'm having lunch with and promptly forget I'm supposed to be in class. Ah. A social climber, Zack said. A sour expression on his face. Say no more. At least you're male, so she wouldn't try to pair us. Well. I do have a 9-year-old sister. Don't go there, Zack warned. Fine, agreed Zorian. He didn't particularly want to continue in that avenue. Anyway. So are you going to tell me who roughed you up or what? You're a lot nosier than I remember, Zack huffed. What makes you think someone roughed me up? Your offhand comments aren't as oblique as you imagine them to be, Zorian said. Whatever, Zack scoffed. I just breathed in some weird fumes while I was messing with my alchemy set yesterday. That all? Ah. The trusty, alchemical accident excuse. So cliché. Yet so effective. Zorian had used it quite a few times himself. In any case, he wasn't willing to let go so easily. He decided to risk it and try to provoke a reaction from the boy. Must have been some really weird fumes. The after effects almost look like soul magic exposure, Zorian speculated loudly. There was an eerie silence in the cafeteria as everyone stared at the crazy boy shouting nonsense in a crowded dining hall. Zack slowly lowered his hands. He had been gesticulating wildly during his little speech, and mumbled an apology that was too quiet for anyone but Zorian to hear. Scattered laughter rippled through the gathered students for a few moments before everything finally returned to normal. Started Zack. Maybe we should continue this at the fountain. Yeah. I don't know, remarked Zorian carefully. If you intend to be this loud. I don't think it will do much. Oh haha, grumbled Zack. So I got a little excited. Not everyone is an ice cube like you, Zorian. Ice cube? Asked Zorian. An undercurrent of warning in his voice. But Zack was already packing. And Zorian could do nothing but huff in annoyance and follow after him. Still. Zack's little outburst answered a few of his questions. So it wasn't his memories. Or even his mind that got sent back, it was his soul. That would certainly explain why his spellwork and shaping skills didn't disappear every time he started over. It was common knowledge that magic was heavily connected to the soul. Even if no one really knew the exact mechanism of their interaction. When they finally reached the fountain, Zack seemed to be in a contemplative mood, so Zorian took a moment to study the schools of colorful fish swimming in the basin of the fountain. He actually pitied the poor things. Since they were unlikely to last long. For years the fountain had been in disrepair. And it was only due to the grander-than-usual summer festival that it was renovated. How likely was it that the academy would continue to maintain it after the occasion passed? Not very. And it was even less likely it would be kept in a good enough condition for the fish to survive. Their days were numbered. Zorian, Zack prodded. Tell me, what do you know about time travel? Zorian blinked. Well. That was direct. Time travel? Zorian asked with as much confusion as he could fake. Not much. I guess. What's that got to do with anything? Ugh. Well, Zack fumbled with words. Scratching his chin nervously. You'll probably think I'm insane. But I'm a time traveler of sorts. Wow. Zack really didn't have a subtle bone in his body. Did he? You don't look very old, Zorian remarked. If you come from the future, it must not be a very far one. No. No. It's more like the whole world resets itself on the night of the summer festival. And I'm the only one who remembers what happened. That was an interesting way of explaining it. Though the idea of a spell affecting the whole world was even more ridiculous than the idea of working time travel magic. I've lived through this month, God. At least 200 times by now, continued Zack. Honestly. I'm starting to lose count. Wait. You're talking about it like you can't stop it, said Zorian, unable to keep a tiny bit of alarm out of his voice. Luckily, Zack appeared to be too agitated to notice. That's just it. I don't know if I can stop it, Zack shouted, before he realized what he was doing and quieted down so as to not attract unneeded attention. I was hit by this spell in the previous revert, and its effects didn't completely go away when I reverted into the past. Zorian frowned. Previous revert? What about the other 7? Did Zack somehow skip those, or did he simply not remember them? It occurred to Zorian that the after effects of the Lich's spell could have been even more serious than what he was currently looking at. What if Zack had spent the past 7 restarts in a coma? Though that begged the question of why his guardian had reported him as missing instead of bringing a healer. I guess it really was a soul magic spell like you said, continued Zack. I need to watch out for those from now on. Anyway. At first I thought it's just some nasty sickness that'll pass. And to a degree I was right. I already feel a lot better than I did this morning. It's just that it wasn't only my body that was affected, my mind has been a little spotty ever since I woke up. Oh no. I don't remember how I started this time loop, concluded Zack, confirming Zorian's fears. Or whether it was me who started it in the first place. My memory is full of blanks like that at the moment. I'm hoping it will all come back to me, but... Zorian stared at the other boy, stony-faced. Basically, they were both in deep shit. Zack seemed to interpret Zorian's serious look a little differently. Though. You don't believe me, he concluded. It's pretty far-fetched, Zorian said. If he hadn't lived through it, he wouldn't have believed him. No. But I'm a pretty open-minded guy. Let's pretend you're right for the moment. What's that got to do with me? Zack arched an eyebrow at him, apparently incredulous about something. Ha, he said. You're really different from your other self. My other self? Zorian asked curiously. Yeah, Zack nodded. My memory may be spotty about some things. But I definitely remember you. Mostly because you kept dying at the start of the attack. Zack mumbled the last sentence in a quiet voice that probably wasn't meant to carry but did. Zorian pretended he didn't hear it. You're different than you used to be, Zack said. You were more irritable. And always busy with something or other. You never believed me when I tried to tell you about the whole time travel thing. You thought I was trying to make fun of you. Well, that kind of story sounded exactly like something his brothers would try to fool him with. And Zack did have a great many things in common with those two already. You've changed, Zack concluded. You're a lot calmer. More laid back. I guess. Zorian frowned. He didn't think he changed that much in personality. But he supposed it would be hard to not change when going through something like this. To say nothing of the fact that more than 8 months had passed since the restart started for Zorian. So. Wait, why did I change then? Zorian asked. Didn't you say the whole world resets itself? Don't know, Zack shrugged. Then gave him a speculative look. Come to think of it. You were there too. Weren't you? Zorian gave him a confused look. He wasn't going to get baited that easily. No. Of course you don't remember, Zack sighed. Do you at least feel a little different lately or something? Come to think of it, yes, confirmed Zorian. I chose different electives than I intended to. For no good reason really. And I did a bunch of other strange things ever since I came to Scioria. Zorian's motivation for saying that was twofold. First of all, he wanted to see how Zack would react to the idea of another person going through the time loop with him. Secondly, he wanted to lay the groundwork for an explanation why he'd be acting differently in every restart. In case he decided not to tell Zack about himself. He was surprised that Zack was so willing to believe him. Though. Apparently even after all this time, nearly 17 years. If the other boy was to be believed, Zack still hasn't developed an ability to effectively read people. That. Or Zorian really was that good of an actor. Strange, was all Zack said. Yeah, Zorian agreed. So any advice a time traveler can tell a mortal like me? A secret spell of awesomeness. Maybe. To be honest, most of the spells I know are combat ones, Zack admitted. I'm really good at combat magic. Which is good because I need to be good at it. There is something I'm trying to stop. Something involving the mysterious adversary that messed you up, tried Zorian. He really wanted to work the invasion into the conversation but didn't know how to justify knowing anything about it. Do you remember how that happened? At least? Ugh, grunted Zack. Mostly. I distinctly remember you being there. But you probably died right at the start of the battle. No offense, Zorian. But you aren't much of a fighter, and then I stupidly charged in, thinking myself invulnerable. Why would you ever think that? Zorian asked. Honestly confused. That you're invulnerable. I mean, doesn't it strike you as dangerously arrogant to perceive yourself as invincible? Do you know how many times I've died in these reverts? Protested Zack. My memory is failing me again. But it was a lot. You tend not to take it too seriously after a while. And it's not like I was too far off. I just have to watch out for necromancy next time. Right? Not just necromancy, Zorian replied with a heavy sigh. There is also mind magic to worry about. Aside from the obvious possibility of ending up as a mind thrall, you could also end up with more than a few gaps in your memory. You could have your whole mind blanked out. Then there is a possibility of having a haze forced upon you if you're too careless. Which also bind to the soul as far as I know. Some creatures, such as wraiths, eat souls. That's another thing to worry about. And there are a couple of methods of sealing away a mage's ability to do magic, which might very well stay with you when you revert. Zack was silent. But Zorian could have sworn he had gotten even paler as he listened to Zorian speak. And that's just a couple of points off the top of my head, finished Zorian. I'm only an academy student. And I don't know anything. It's obvious, Air. You are not invulnerable. Okay. Zorian swallowed heavily. That was close. It was fortunate that Zack was so oblivious. Because had the situation been reversed, he would have called Zack out on it ages ago. Wow. You almost sound like you care, Zack finally said with a nervous chuckle. You really do believe I'm a time traveler now? Huh. Zorian shrugged. I'm not completely convinced. But it's not something that's worth fighting over, in my opinion. If you say you're a time traveler, then we'll pretend you're a time traveler. Yes. Until he got a better feel for Zack's character and understood what the deal was with the time loop, he would pretend. When Zorian finally returned to school, having missed both the remainder of essential invocations and the following lecture about magical law, he was beset by curious classmates and AKO. AKO was easy to deal with, since she only wanted to scold him for taking too long and warn him. She recorded his absence in the attendance record. Zorian was pretty sure the only person, teachers included, who cared about what was written on that list was Akoja. The ones that wanted to know what's wrong with Zack were also easy. It was an alchemical accident. What? It's the excuse Zack used. Unfortunately, many people also wanted to know why he had suddenly volunteered to take him home. Or what had taken him so long. Nosy people. And they were persistent too, refusing to leave him alone for the rest of the day. When Zorian finally reached his room, he immediately locked his door and breathed a sigh of relief. He finally had enough time to think about what he found out today. Zack was confident he would be fine by tomorrow. And that his memory would come back to him. Zorian was not nearly as confident. That Zack had a 7-month gap in his memory, and possibly existence, suggested something very serious had been done to him. Why hadn't Zorian suffered anything of the sort? Well, maybe he had. He had felt uncharacteristically tired in his first restart. But had written it off as mental stress. Maybe he had only been caught at the very edge of the spell and thus only suffered minor damage. Or maybe his first restart was only the first one he had memory of. It was a disturbing possibility. But there was not much point in dwelling on it much. It really wasn't that unexpected. When you really thought about it. The strange time travel effect he and Zack were under had essentially turned them into soul entities. A lich was, at its core, also a soul entity. They were mages that ritually killed themselves and tethered their souls to an object, their phylactery, before it could move on into the afterlife. If the form they currently inhabited ever got destroyed, they'd snap back to their phylactery and simply possess someone. It would make sense for a lich to know how to fight another lich. And a method that worked against a lich would work just as well against him and Zack. And Zack had stupidly said as much to the lich at the end of their battle. It's not like I'll be dead for good, indeed. The lich may not have known what Zack was exactly. But a statement like that strongly suggested he was either a lich himself or some kind of a possessor entity. And from a practical standpoint it wasn't that far off. But that was all neither here nor there. The real question was, what was he going to do now? Even if Zack regained his memories, doubtful. He would no doubt want to keep the time loop going until he found a way to defeat the lich. If the boy's previous altercation with the undead mage was of any indication, that could take a while. And that was assuming Zack was the originator of the spell in the first place. If it happened once, it could have happened twice. He had a sneaking suspicion that Zack might be as much of a stowaway as Zorian was. Was there a third looping person running around? Suddenly, he didn't feel as desperate to get out of this thing as he was at the start of it. Getting out might not necessarily mean going back to normal. The invasion was clearly more than a random terrorist attack. And Zorian somehow doubted that stopping it would be the end of it. Something very big was happening. And Zorian was a very small fish. A roach. As Taven would charmingly say. Inside the time loop. He had a chance to secure his future. Outside of it, he was just another victim. Besides, if Zack was to be believed, normal for Zorian meant getting killed at the start of the invasion. He didn't care much for that kind of normal. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more it seemed to him this whole thing was a giant opportunity rather than an annoyance. Once upon a time, when Zorian was younger, he dreamt of being a great mage. The sort that legends were made of. The kind that revolutionized whole fields of magic all by themselves. In time this dream died as it became clear he didn't have the talent, the work ethic, or the right connections to make that happen. He was just a slightly above average civilian-born student with no special advantages to his name. But now, he had all the time he needed to build up an advantage over his peers and become truly great. Greater than Daimen. He shook his head, abandoning that train of thought. He was getting ahead of himself. He needed something more concrete than a fuzzy notion of greatness to guide him, a clear set of goals to achieve. And courses of action to pursue. Right now, the only thing he could think of was harassing Zack for some tips. Raiding the library for more spells. And leveraging his curious monetary situation to improve his alchemical skills. He was leery about relying on Zack for help. Even if the boy would be cooperative. There was only so much he could learn from the other time traveler without revealing that he too retained his memories each time they reverted to the past. The library was full of spells. Of course. But anything serious, that is. That could be used for combat. Crime. Or spying, was restricted. And he knew from talking to older students that teachers were really stingy with permission slips. Not even Fortov succeeded in getting one. And he could charm a troll into not eating him. Honing his alchemy skills was definitely an option. The only reason he focused more heavily on invocation thus far was because he had to buy any ingredients he wished to work with. And he was trying to save money. Any serious study of alchemy required a lot of funds. Alchemical ingredients were expensive. With his saving account spontaneously refilling after each restart. However, monetary concerns didn't limit him as much as they did before. It wasn't much. To be honest. He needed a better plan. With another sigh, Zorian pulled out his trusty notebook and began to plot and write. "Something I can do for you, Sonny?" asked Kiran. "The class has been dismissed. In case you didn't notice." I noticed. I just wanted to talk to you about something," Zorian said. Kiran gestured him to keep talking. "I hope you don't find it insulting. But your stated program seems a bit easy. Practicing magic missile for a whole month seems rather pointless to me. Since I already have a pretty good grasp on it." Kiran stared at him for a few seconds. Zorian suppressed the instinct to shuffle nervously in place and returned the man's stare. Kiran seemed like a sort of person who would be impressed by that. "I hope you don't find it insulting, Sonny. But you just don't have enough power to be a proper battle mage," Kiran finally said. "Your shaping skills are rather impressive for your age. But you tire after only 10 shots from the rod. And that just won't do in any serious combat." "Well, I kind of know that," admitted Zorian. His reserves had increased slightly from what they were when he first tackled this class. So 10 shots was actually an improvement. "Incidentally, is there anything I can do about that?" "Nothing I would recommend," Kiran said, shaking his head. "Your mana reserves will grow as your proficiency in magic grows. Of course. But so will everyone else's. You will always be at a disadvantage against naturally powerful opponents. Which would be most of the professional battle mages. Of course. I cannot forbid you from pursuing a career as a battle mage. But I definitely advise you against it. There are plenty of magical disciplines where great shaping skills are an asset. But combat magic is mostly about power." "I see," said Zorian. He didn't intend to become a battle mage. But he had a feeling he was going to need some combat magic. Whether he liked it or not. At the very least he wanted to be able to deal with any stray winter wolves or trolls he might encounter during the invasion. Though my point still stands. Since I can already do the spell well enough. And that's the only thing you intend to instruct us in for the foreseeable future. I can see little point in attending the class for the foreseeable future." "Humph," Kiran snorted. "Trying blackmail on me, Sonny?" It's fine. I don't mind. And I do understand your point of view here." Kiran rubbed his chin for a second, mulling something over in his head. "Wait here." 15 minutes later Kiran returned with another spell rod, a small booklet, and 4 ceramic plates. He threw the plates toward Zorian, who hastily caught them before they shattered upon the ground. "Good reflexes," Kiran complimented. "They're actually reinforced. So you don't have to worry about dropping them too much." He took one of the spell rods they used in class and grasped it firmly in his hand. "Let me demonstrate something to you. Throw one of the plates to my left." Zorian immediately complied. And Kiran wordlessly pointed the rod in the plate's general direction and fired. He was wide of the mark. But the bolt of force actually homed in on the plate anyway, curving through the air to intercept it. The plate shattered into dust and sharp fragments. Again, Kiran snapped. Zorian threw another plate. And another bolt of force sped towards it. This one was different. However, it was longer and thinner. Like an oversized needle. It hit the plate. But instead of smashing it to pieces, it went right through it, punching a hole through the center before dissipating. Throw the last two together, Kiran instructed. 2 plates flew into the air. And Kiran once again pointed the rod in their general direction. Zorian waited for the bolt of force. But none was forthcoming. Instead, both plates were suddenly cut in half by some unseen blades. Kiran lowered his hand and began to speak. The reason I'll be spending so much time on Magic Missile is because it's a very versatile spell, Kiran spoke. In its simplest form. It takes the form of a shining bolt of force that travels in a straight line, delivering concussive blasts of force to whatever it impacts. This variant is often called the Smasher. And it is a very simple and effective spell. A skilled mage can do so much more with it. However, you can use animation magic to make it home in on a target. You can sharpen it into a point that will pierce things instead of batter them. Or a line to cut them, the piercer and cutter, respectively. You can fire multiple missiles instead of one, a swarm. Even if you have the reserves and skill to pull it off. And, of course, you can make the projectile invisible. Invisible? Asked Zorian. Yes, Kiran agreed. A perfectly cast force spell is completely transparent. The light show you usually see is magical leakage resulting from an imperfect spell boundary. The speed with which combat magic is cast virtually guarantees that some mistakes in constructing the spell boundary will be made. And even if no mistakes are made, the large amounts of mana pumped into the constructs can easily distort or unravel some of the pieces. So I'm messing the spell up, summarized Zorian. Thinking of the brightly shining projectiles he always got when he used the rod. Wait. Your missiles normally shine too. Is that dash? Kiran chuckled. Like I said at the start, there are plenty of magical disciplines where great shaping skills are an asset. But combat magic is mostly about power. Most battle mages can't even make a simple magic missile transparent. Much less one of the higher level force spells. It doesn't hold them back any. Even I usually don't bother. Since the benefits are so marginal. You, on the other hand, need every advantage you can get. Kiran pushed the spell rod and the accompanying booklet into Zorian's hands. You are right that you won't learn much in class in the next month or so. The Smasher may be simple. But more than half of your classmates are having trouble with it as it is. And you're the only one that truly has a good grasp on it. So read the booklet. Find some targets to practice on. And make sure there is a friend nearby while you practice to get help if you screw up big. Oh. And don't hurt anyone with the rod I'm loaning you or I'll be mad. Come back to me in 2 weeks so I can see how you're progressing. Right, agreed Zorian enthusiastically. This went a lot better than he thought it would. Now get lost, Kiran gestured towards the door. You've wasted my entire coffee break already. Zorian dropped the stack of books on a nearby table and surveyed the shelves. He had decided to try his luck as a library employee again. Hoping he would find a way to get around spell restrictions as an employee. Zack had been absent from class for a couple of days at this point. Probably still suffering from the aftereffects of the soul spell. So he couldn't simply trick the answer out of his fellow time traveler. And besides, he wanted to learn those book divinations he was promised before being brutally murdered. And all. He wasn't in a hurry to get Kirathishli to teach him those divination spells. Though the magic missile variations Kiran gave him to practice were giving him enough problems as it was. Like Kiran had said at the beginning of the lecture. The problem was that shaping had to be done in an instant and involved shoving a great deal of his mana reserves into a hastily constructed spell boundary. That was easy enough when you just wanted a bolt that traveled in a straight line and smashed things. But trying to weave, say, a homing function into the spell was a chore to do in a fraction of a second. To say nothing of trying to eliminate all the little imperfections and make the bolt transparent. Which is not to say he made no progress. He could make the bolt curve towards a target even if his aim was a little off. And he managed to make a flawless piercer yesterday. Progress. You're pretty good at this stuff, Ivory remarked beside him, putting a book on the shelf. I'm surprised. Usually it takes a while for people to really understand the system we use here. I guess you worked in a library before. Huh. Yeah, agreed Zorian. It was technically true. It was surprisingly similar to this one in organization. It's not really surprising, Kirathishli said behind him, causing him to jump in surprise. All state libraries use the same organizing system. It's a standard enforced by the Society of Librarians. Hell. Even the systems of other splinter nations are pretty similar. Because they all used to be part the same country, guessed Zorian. It is debatable whether or not the old alliance could be considered a unified state, Kirathishli said. The name says it all. Really it was an alliance more than anything. Arguably it was the attempt to turn it into a state that led to the Splinter Wars. But yes. Being once part of the old alliance. The Splinter Nations inherited much of its administrative legacy, including library organization. Zorian was starting to understand why Kirathishli had such strained relations with the current headmaster. He knew very little about the man. But what he did suggested he was very politically involved and well, patriotic. And the country they were living in made its official position clear there was no old alliance. Because the alliance of Eldamar never ended. It simply shrank. That this was a completely ridiculous claim was self-evident to citizens domestic and foreigner alike. But most found it easier to humor the politicians. Kirathishli apparently went a step further and denied there was a predecessor state to be an inheritor of in the first place. A fiery, opinionated woman that she was. She probably said something of the sort within the headmaster's earshot. That must have been a fun conversation. Hey, called a familiar voice. Is Zorian here? I heard dash. Don't shout in the library. Zack, Zorian sighed. Since you're back to your usual exuberance. I'm guessing you're alright now. Yup. Zack said happily, thumping his chest a few times. Healthy like an oak. Got an hour to grab something to eat? In case you haven't noticed. I'm working at the moment, Zorian protested. It's not an issue. Zorian. We're mostly done for the day, Kirathishli pointed out. Then she leaned towards him and whispered into his ear. Unless you wanted to get rid of him and I'm interfering. Zorian waved her concerns away and followed Zack outside. As amusing as it would be to see what Kirathishli would say to Zack to get rid of him. He actually wanted to talk to the boy. So how come you sought me out? Zorian asked. He thought he'd have to hound the boy to get more information. But it seemed Zack had taken a liking to him. He didn't know whether to be pleased or annoyed by that. It was convenient. But it increased the chances that he'd realize something was off with Zorian. You're the most interesting person I know of at the moment. And the only other person who believes me about time travel except Nialu, Zack said. Nialu? Asked Zorian incredulously. She's an avid reader of speculative fiction and mysteries and is very imaginative and open-minded, said Zack. Nah, V dreamer. Her father would say. It was surprisingly easy to convince her I'm really a time traveler. I guess she wants to believe it's true. Ah, said Zorian. He supposed that he knew now why Zack involved Nialu so much the first time he went through this month. He still didn't know who the other girl was. Though. And didn't know how he might work her into the conversation. How many people did you try to convince? Anyway, asked Zorian. All of our classmates and teachers. The headmaster. And the heads of every police department in the city. A couple of nobles and other influential people. How persistent. Not very successful. I imagine, Zorian guessed. That's putting it mildly, Zack sighed. Zorian frowned. Suddenly realizing something. Why did Zack try to convince all those people he was a time traveler? That didn't sound like something a time traveler that came specifically to stop the invasion would do. It sounded more like something Zorian briefly considered when he realized how utterly over the head he was. But ultimately decided to scrap the idea because he expected the results to be more or less identical to what Zack got. Zack, began Zorian carefully. What about those gaps in your memory? Are they? They're still there, Zack scowled. I'm pretty sure they're not increasing anymore though. Thank the gods. Agreed Zorian. So you don't know how you achieved this time travel magic? Then. I looked it up. And it's supposed to be impossible. You know. As impossible as drawing a square triangle. In fact. Well, it's clearly not that impossible. Is it? Zack countered. But no. I have no idea how I did that. If I did that. If you did that, agreed Zorian. From your comments I'm getting a feeling you started these reverts as a common academy student. And I mean no offense. But the Zack I remember wasn't really the kind of person capable of inventing any spell. Much less something as concept-breaking as time travel. Zack chuckled nervously. You're probably right. I used to be really bad at this whole mage business. Didn't I? But enough of such depressing topics. Because I've got good news for you. Oh? Zorian asked curiously. Yes, Zack confirmed. I heard you've been trying to learn combat magic. Where did you hear that? Protested Zorian. Kirin told the rest of the teachers. The teachers told the administrative staff. The administrative staff told the janitors and other low-paying workers. They told the students. And the students told me, finished Zack. What does it matter? What matters is that I'm very good at combat magic thanks to the reverts. And that I've decided to teach you. Think of it as a reward for believing me. Zorian gave Zack an incredulous look. He was going to help him out on his own free will. Just like that. No need for any plotting or subtle maneuvering. Almost disappointing. What? Zack protested. It's true. I really am good at combat magic. In fact. That's the field I'm most talented at. Oh. Now that's a wonderful opening. Not that I don't believe you. But how exactly did you get so good at combat magic? Asked Zorian. I mean. Mages are really stingy about sharing combat magic. Even with these reverts, why would they share them with an academy student like you? Especially since you're, known to be irresponsible, Zack finished for him. To be honest. I didn't get the spells I know legally. I wouldn't recommend my methods of acquiring combat magic to anyone who isn't a time traveler. You tend to die a lot. Oh. Yeah. But you have me. So there's that. Quietly wondering what he was getting himself into. Zorian followed after him. Here we are, said Zack happily. Twirling around with his hands outstretched. What do you think? Zorian studied the meadow in front of him. His eyes darting back and forth with suspicion. At first glance the area was just a large patch of grass surrounded by a ring of trees. But Zorian couldn't help but notice signs of obvious neglect. The grass was too wild and tall. And the space between trees was full of young saplings fighting for their own place under the sun. It was a good place to practice combat magic at. But also a good place to hide a body in. In an even remotely normal situation, Zorian wouldn't be caught dead following a complete stranger into a creepy, isolated place like this one. Oh, how far his perspective had shifted. I wonder what's keeping the saplings confined to that ring of trees, wondered Zorian aloud. This meadow should be a copse of trees by now. Zack blinked. I never thought about that, he admitted. You notice the strangest things. Zorian. I also wonder how a place like this can exist at all, Zorian continued. I mean, we're in Scioria. Land is very expensive here. Why is someone letting this place deteriorate like this instead of selling it? Oh. That's easy, Zack said. It's my land. Or rather, it's part of the Novita family estates. It's supposed to be a private garden for the head of house. Or something like that. So no one could do anything with it unless they had my explicit permission. But since I hadn't even known this place existed before the reverts yet. Zorian agreed. I guess I should have expected something like that. Your home is pretty close from here. Isn't it? You know where I live? Zack asked. Surprise evident in his voice. Crap. What to say? What to say? Of course I know where you live, Zorian said. Looking at Zack like the boy was an idiot for asking. Who doesn't know where the Novita estate is located? A lot of people. Probably. Zorian himself certainly hadn't known. Not until he tried to track Zack down in one of the restarts. Heh. I'm pretty famous. Aren't I? Zack said. Grinning widely. Note to self, Zack is easy to distract by appealing to his pride. Yeah. Yeah, sighed Zorian. So is the great Novita going to help me learn combat magic like he promised or not? Daylight's burning. Zack snapped his fingers. Apparently remembering just why they came here in the first place. His hands blurred into a sequence of gestures. And several humanoids made of earth rose from the ground on the other side of the clearing. Zorian gaped. Now that was impressive. Zack didn't even have to chant anything to cast that spell. And he went through the gestures with such speed Zorian had trouble remembering what they even were. Plus, those earthen constructs weren't just immobile statues, they moved. It was in times like this that Zorian remembered he was dealing with a vastly superior mage that had him beat in virtually every conceivable way. It was humbling. To say the least. Wow, he said out loud. It's not as impressive as it looks, Zack said. They're nearly useless in actual battle. They make good targets though. Since they're pretty resilient and reform each time you mess them up. Zack fired a quick magic missile at one of the statues to demonstrate. Hitting it square in the chest. The earthen construct took a step back from the force of the bolt. And a web of cracks erupted from the impact point. But the cracks quickly sealed themselves shut and the construct otherwise completely ignored the attack. I don't believe this, Zorian stated incredulously. What do you mean? Zack asked. They're just animated earth, so it's dash. Not them, Zorian protested. The magic missile. No chant. No gestures. No spell formula. No nothing. You just pointed your finger at the target and produced a magic missile. Which, admittedly, was a gesture. Not one that should be sufficient to produce a magic missile. Though. Oh. That, Zack said. Waving his hand dismissively. That's not terribly special either. That's just reflexive magic. When you cast a spell enough times dash. Mana shaping becomes instinctive and you can start leaving out spell components, finished Zorian for him. Any serious mage had at least a couple of spells they knew so intimately they could leave out a couple of words and gestures and still get it working. But getting a spell to work with something as simple as pointing a finger would take years. Zack simply grinned from ear to ear. Which? I guess you had, Zorian concluded. Feeling rather stupid. This time travel thing is really convenient. Isn't it? How many reflexive spells do you have? Anyway. You mean? How many are as reflexive as the magic missile I just showed you? Shield. Hurl. Recall. Flamethrower. And a couple of other easy combat spells. There are a lot of spells I'm familiar with. But I can't exactly throw fireballs by pointing my fingers. Right, said Zorian sourly. He was getting way past humbling and straight into feeling mightily inadequate territory. Better steer the conversation back to the lesson before Zack completely demoralized him. So where do we start? Kirin gave you a spell rod and told you to practice magic missile. Didn't he? Asked Zack. Yeah, confirmed Zorian. Well. Let's see how that's working out for you first, said Zack, waving his hand in the direction of the earthen constructs. Fire a couple of missiles at the mud people. Mud people? Asked Zorian incredulously. Is that Dash? Probably not, Zack admitted. I kind of forgot the official name of the spell. So I just refer to it as, create mud people. It doesn't matter all that much since the spell is obscure and obsolete. And virtually no one except me uses it. I guess, agreed Zorian. He was tempted to ask more. But figured he would never get to actual spell practice if he kept distracting Zack with his questions. He pointed the spell rod Kirin gave him at the closest mud person and fired. He was a bit surprised when the construct tried to sidestep his magic missile instead of soaking the spell like it did when Zack targeted it. But that didn't save it. He had enough control of the spell to alter the missile's flight path. Accordingly, even if he couldn't get the bolt to home in on the target on its own. Of course. The bolt did very little actual damage to the construct. And even that repaired itself quickly. Undeterred, Zorian kept firing. His next shot was a piercer aimed at the head of the construct, which succeeded in hitting it squarely in the forehead but failed to actually punch through the animated earth. He tried to shape the next bolt into a cutter. But all he got was a diffuse blob of multicolored light that popped like a soap bubble halfway to the target. The next two were regular smashers, one of which missed when its target leaned to the side at the last moment before the bolt hit him. Zorian stopped at this point, not wanting to completely deplete his mana reserves. He demonstrated pretty much everything he achieved so far. Anyway. Zack clapped overdramatically, completely ignoring the mild glare Zorian sent his way. You've only been practicing. What? For a couple of days? Asked Zack. Zorian nodded. And you can direct your bolts already? You're a lot better than I thought you'd be. Oh? Asked Zorian, a hint of warning in his voice. And why is that? Let me ask you this instead, how many magic missiles can you cast before you run out of mana? Asked Zack. 10, answered Zorian. He didn't see what that Normally learning time corresponds to mana capacity. Doesn't it? Yup. The bigger your mana reserves, the longer you can train each day, confirmed Zack. It means mages with larger reserves tend to learn faster than their less gifted compatriots. Assuming everyone is equally dedicated and equally good at shaping mana, noted Zorian. Assuming that, agreed Zack. Though the difference in mana reserves tends to overshadow almost everything else. Do you know how many magic missiles I can cast before I run out of mana? Zorian hadn't forgotten Zack's seemingly inexhaustible mana reserves that he demonstrated during the invasion, and was aware that the number must be pretty high. Still, there was a limit to how big your mana reserves could get. The booklet Kirin gave him said average mages can fire somewhere between 8 to 12 magic missiles before running out of mana, while very gifted ones could manage as much as 20 or 30. Furthermore, while mana reserves increased with age and practice. They were not unlimited in potential. Most people's maximum was roughly 4 times the amount of mana reserves they started with. And usually less. Assuming Zack was in the above average range, something his comments and attitude strongly suggested. And that he achieved his maximum due to the time loop. 50, he tried. 232, said Zack smugly. Zorian almost dropped the spell rod in shock. But in the end settled for staring at Zack like he just swallowed a live chicken. 232. What the hell? Admittedly, I'm at the extreme high end when it comes to mana reserves, Zack said. Understatement of the century. And unlike you, I've spent years building them up. So they're as high as they're ever going to be. Still, even if you had a lifetime of practice, you'd probably never go over 40. That would make my reserves almost 6 times larger than yours. Quite a disadvantage to make up for. No kidding, agreed Zorian. I'm guessing that's where you come in. Unless you brought me here just to tell me how much I suck compared to you. Ha! I admit the look on your face when you realized how awesome I am was absolutely priceless. But that's just a bonus, said Zack. He beckoned for Zorian to come closer and Zorian complied, allowing Zack to cast a completely unfamiliar spell on him. Zorian felt the spell seep into his eyes. Foreign mana straining against the innate magical resistance possessed by every living creature. And briefly considered snuffing the spell out before it took root. Not because he thought the spell was harmful, mind you, but out of principle. Zack just cast a spell on him without asking for permission or explaining what the spell did. Which was a major breach of magical etiquette no matter how you looked at it. In the end he decided not to be that spiteful and simply reeled in his magical resistance, allowing the spell to do its work unopposed. You already have control over your magical resistance, asked Zack. Sweet. I usually have to teach people how to do that first. Hell. I didn't know how to do that before the reverts. Zorian frowned, ignoring Zack's comments in favor of trying to figure out what the spell actually did. It was concentrated in his eyes. So he should see. Oh. A glowing, mind-bogglingly huge pillar rose into the sky, warping and undulating like a living being, occasionally spawning short-lived whirls of glowing matter along its length. It only took Zorian a moment to realize what he was looking at. That's how the hole looks like under Mage sight, he asked, focusing back on Zack. Magnificent. Isn't it? Zack said. Watching that huge geyser of mana rising into the sky always puts things into perspective for me. Mage sight shouldn't work in Scioria. Though, remarked Zorian. Too much ambient mana saturating everything. Why aren't I blinded by painful glow emanating from everything in sight? It's an experimental variation that tries to filter out such noise. Showing only the important stuff, said Zack. It's not terribly reliable. But it will do for our purposes. Those being, asked Zorian. I'll cast magic missile repeatedly and you'll watch what I'm doing for a while before trying to copy me, Zack said. I'll be using the proper invocation this time. And go at it as slowly as I can. Try to memorize the words and gestures. Because you'll be using them instead of the rod Kirin gave you. A spell rod is more useful in combat. But for training purposes it's better to work with actual invocations. Zorian was completely on board with the idea. He had been trying to find invocations for combat spells for a while now. Anyway, Zack was underestimating him. Though. Try to memorize. Zorian might not have Zack's absurd mana reserves. But his memory was quite good. It took only one proper casting from Zack and Zorian had already burned the casting procedure into his memory. Unfortunately, the rest of the session was a lot less impressive. Zack kept performing the spell a few more times before instructing Zorian to give it a try. Upon which he found out that performing combat magic with classical invocations wasn't only slower than using a spell rod, it was a lot harder too. Thankfully, the fact that he actually saw how the mana was supposed to be shaped during Zack's demonstration drastically improved his learning speed. So he managed to fire off a passable magic missile in the end. He was completely out of mana by then. However, and Zack decided that was a good time to stop for the day. Walking back to his apartment, Zorian was lost in thought. Zack's comment about the giant pillar of mana putting things into perspective for him seemed oddly applicable to his situation as well. Time loop or not, he would never beat Zack and people like him at their own game. Clearly Zorian couldn't bulldoze his way through with combat magic, like Zack intended to do. No. If he was going to get out of this in a favorable manner, he had to forge his own path. If only he knew what that path was. Though, at the moment, getting to the bottom of what caused this time loop and how the damn thing worked seemed to be just about the only thing he could do to help himself. Which was unfortunate, because he just didn't have the skills to unravel the mystery. Apparently he had to spend some time improving his magical abilities. Time, at least, he had in spades. Probably, he could never be sure the time loop would continue happening. But Zack certainly didn't behave like it would end any time soon. And Zorian decided to follow Zack's lead in that regard. He really wished he had someone other than Zack to ask for advice on how to proceed in his quest to improve himself. Typically, this was what a student's mentor was for. But he already knew what Svim would tell him: more shaping exercises. Then he'd throw marbles at him. Although Ilsa did offer to take over his mentorship in a couple of restarts. Didn't she? Despite his desire for some additional help, Zorian delayed approaching Ilsa until he actually had a few sessions with Svim. That would require a lengthy wait. But it would make it easier to complain about Svim's mentoring methods, since he wouldn't have to explain how he knew so much about the man already. It wasn't like he didn't have anything to amuse himself in the meantime. Zack was, if anything, even more enthusiastic about their combat magic practice sessions than Zorian was, insisting they meet up every day after classes. After 2 weeks of such practice, Zorian was not only able to weave a proper homing function into the magic missile spell, but also learned how to cast shield and flamethrower spells as well. He was keenly aware that his ability to cast such spells would amount to exactly 0 against a human battlemage. But he also knew they weren't the only threats he faced. Those spells might buy him a second or two against a winter wolf or a troll, which could be the difference between life and death. "What am I supposed to tell them?" he asked Zack. They were both in the cafeteria, and he had noticed a couple of students glancing at him a bit too often, doubtlessly waiting for the chance to talk to him when Zack left. "I can't exactly tell them you're a time traveler." "Why not?" Zack asked. "Time travel. It's what I say every time they ask me how I got this good." "You actually tell them you're a time traveler?" asked Zorian incredulously. He didn't know whether to laugh or bang his head against the table. "Yeah," confirmed Zack. "What's the worst that could happen?" Zorian felt a pang of phantom pain in his chest. Where? In another timeline, a masked assassin stabbed him through and killed him. Did Zack honestly never experience consequences like that when trying to convince people of his story? Then again, he said he tried to convince them he was a time traveler. Not that he told them about the invasion. In fact, he didn't actually tell Zorian about that either. He danced around the topic whenever Zorian tried to lead the conversation in that particular direction. This could have all been avoided if you just held back a little in classes, Zorian sighed. "I kind of like the attention," Zack admitted. "Really?" asked Zorian. I'm only going through this once and I'm already sick of it. You're saying the novelty of all that attention still hasn't worn off after. What? More than a decade? Oh come on. Do you really think I spend these reverts attending classes? Of all things, scoffed Zack. That got seriously old after the third revert or so. I spend most of the time doing my own thing. Hell. Usually I'm not even near Scioria. I only attend the classes when I want to relax or when I am feeling nostalgic. The only reason why I'm here right now is because I got kind of roughed up in my last revert and I'm still trying to sort out the holes in my memory. Oh. And because you've kind of caught my interest. Why did I catch your interest? Though? Asked Zorian. Not that I'm complaining or anything. But how come you're willing to invest so much time in me? Isn't it all going to be useless in the next revert? That's a pretty cold way of thinking about things, Zack said. I don't really think like that. I've tried to get to know all of our classmates in these reverts. Even though some of them were pretty uncooperative with the idea. And I've never thought of it as a waste of time. This is the first time I've gotten you this friendly. And I have no idea what exactly I did to cause that. It's best to make use of it while I can. Now he was starting to feel pretty bad. Not only had he never tried to get to know any of his classmates during the reverts. The idea had never even occurred to him. And this wasn't the first time Zack had insinuated that Zorian was kind of a jerk to him in the past. Just what had happened between Zack and past Zorian to leave that much of an impression? I see, said Zorian uncertainly. Not knowing how to respond to that. I really do wonder about you. Though, Zack continued. You're so different from the Zorian I knew. I'm starting to wonder if you're really the same person. Who else would I be? Asked Zorian. Honestly at a loss as to where Zack was going with this. He didn't appear to have figured out that Zorian was reverting. As he would say. So what was he getting at? I think I may have shifted timelines. Or something, Zack said. Zorian gave him an incredulous look. Shifted timelines. That's his explanation. Really? Really? He almost revealed himself right then and there. Just so he could tell him how silly that was. Almost. Or something, deadpan Zorian. What? Protested Zack. It could happen. Do you know how temporal mechanics work? No. Didn't think so. I did look up a couple of books about time travel after our first meeting, said Zorian. It was a lie. Of course. But only a small one. He had sifted through time travel related texts. Just not in this particular restart. And learned nothing, concluded Zack. It's a total wasteland. All they write about is about various ethical dilemmas and time paradoxes and whatnot. That was the first and last time I set foot in the Academy library. Let me tell you. Zorian gave him a strange look. That was a joke. Right? Which part? Zack asked. The part where you only visited the Academy library once, clarified Zorian. Well, tried Zack. Chuckling nervously. What can I say? I don't really like to read. Zorian stared at Zack. Wondering if the boy was pulling his leg. He would totally understand if the old Zack, the one he knew before the time loop, told him he never set foot in the library. He wouldn't be terribly unique in that regard. Lots of students never visited the library before their third year. Since they couldn't access the spell repository before their certification. Anyway. But this Zack had lived through this month over 200 times. And had access to the spells buried within its depths. And he never tried to search through it. Because he didn't like to read. The mind boggled. Well. Zorian's mind boggled. You've clearly read our textbooks, Zorian noted. There's no way you'd excel as well as you do otherwise. Yeah. Well. I didn't say I don't read at all, Zack countered. Just that I'd rather avoid it if I can. I learn much better by example anyway. Funny. It was just the opposite with Zorian. He tended to learn much better when he had the chance to study the topic on his own before trying. He still thought it was a pretty serious flaw for a mage to avoid books. But Zorian had to remind himself that Zack was clearly achieving results somehow. Come to think of it, there was a serious shortage of anything dangerous in the Academy's spell collection. So a mage that was chiefly interested in the more restricted areas of magic would find the library of very limited usefulness. So you learn primarily by mentorship, guessed Zorian. I'm surprised you can convince mages to teach you in less than a month. Don't they all require apprenticeships lasting for several years before they'll agree to teach you anything useful? Well, usually, said Zack. But I'm the last novita. Don't you know? I had highly respectable mages tripping over themselves to teach me my whole life. Usually I just have to show up and tell them who I am and they're all too happy to help me out. Zorian suppressed a wave of jealousy that washed over him. Zack was just making the most of his unique situation. Just like Zorian would have in his place. It still bothered him, though, reminding him of how Daimen and Fortov could ask and get all sorts of help and concessions from their teachers. Only for Zorian to fail in securing the same for himself. His parents had lectured him endlessly that the difference was in their attitudes, that if only Zorian was more sociable, more polite, more everything, he too could enjoy the same benefits. To Zorian, it always seemed like his brothers had some sort of invisible tattoo on their foreheads that only mages could see, and which marked them as somehow more special than him. Zack wasn't his brothers, though, and didn't deserve to be the target for Zorian's personal frustrations. Convenient, said Zorian out loud, giving his fellow time traveler a smile that was somewhat forced. Zack didn't appear to notice. His jealousy aside, he was really starting to wonder if his assumption about Zack being an accidental stowaway like him had any merit at all. Zack had ridiculously huge mana reserves. Probably the largest of any student currently attending the academy. He was the last member of a famous noble house, enjoying all the prestige that comes from that without having to deal with nosy parents who might be freaked out by Zack's sudden transformation. In addition to the power inherent in his name, the boy was also fairly charming and outgoing, further improving his chances of getting help from otherwise unapproachable high-circle mages. He was not your average spoiled prince. By any means, there was a lot of potential in the boy. If only he would get enough time to bring it out. Time that Zack now had. It was convenient. A bit too convenient, in Zorian's opinion. That is why, despite Zack's seeming friendliness, Zorian just didn't feel at ease with the boy. Not enough to reveal himself as a stowaway. In any case, right now, his main advantage was that he was an outside element in this game Zack was playing. An unaccounted variable. He intended to use and abuse that advantage for all it was worth. Whatever force was behind Zack, Zorian had no intention of revealing himself to it any time soon. Take a seat, Mr. Kaczynski, Ilsa said. I sort of suspected I'd be seeing you soon. You did? Asked Zorian. Oh yes, Ilsa said. Usually students come knocking at my door immediately after a single session with Svim. You actually waited until the second one. So points for patience. Right, said Zorian sourly. I can't transfer you to another mentor at this time, though. So I'm afraid you'll just have to bear with him for now, she said. I sort of expected that, Zorian said. Why should her answer be any different than it was the last time he asked her? It's not what I'm here for. No? Asked Ilsa, raising an eyebrow. No, confirmed Zorian. Since everything I've heard and experienced about Svim suggests we'll never progress beyond the basic 3. I've decided to be proactive about self-study. I've been hoping for some pointers from you where I should start. What I should watch out for. That sort of thing. Ilse sighed heavily. It's hard to give that sort of advice. Mr. Kaczynski. That's why the Academy gives students mentors, because there is no one-size-fits-all solution. I suppose I could give you advice about my own subject. Though. How good are you at the basic 3? Depends who you ask, said Zorian. Most of the teachers from my second year told me I had them mastered. Svim says I'm ashamed to mages everywhere. She snorted and handed him a pen. Actually handed it to him. Not threw it at him like Svim would have. Ah. The joy of interacting with sane teachers. Levitate that, Ilse said. She wasn't even finished talking and the pen was already spinning above his outstretched palm. Oh. So you can already spin the levitated object? Ilse said. Sounding pleased. I bet Svim was very happy with that. No. Not really. Do you know any other variation? No, said Zorian. Don't tell me learning those is standard. Procedure. Not like Svim is teaching them, Ilse said. But yes. Most mentors will give students variations of the basic 3 to improve their shaping skills. And how many of those variations are there? Asked Zorian. Oh. Thousands, said Ilse. Confirming Zorian's suspicions. But most students only learn 6 or so by the end of their 3rd year. Here. She pushed a rather heavy book into his hands. Patiently waiting for him to leaf through it. It was apparently a book describing 15 particularly interesting variations of the basic 3. 5 for each exercise. Let me guess, you want me to learn everything inside this book, Zorian sighed. That would be a pretty neat trick, Ilse snorted. Didn't you hear what I said? Most people learn 6 or less in a year. You'll probably be finished with the Academy by the time you've learned everything inside that book. Assuming you want to. Of course I'm not making you do anything. 6 in a year. Huh? Asked Zorian carefully. An idea forming in his mind. That's right, Ilse confirmed. So what if I could master all 15 before this month is done? Asked Zorian. Ilse stared at him for a second before bursting into laughter. It took her a few seconds to calm down. My. Aren't you the confident one? Ilse said. Chuckling softly. If you were really that good. I'd fill out the transfer forms right now. Regulations be damned. And take you as my apprentice. I'd never pass up an opportunity to teach such a legend in the making. Not that I think you could do it. Mind you. Zorian just gave her a wicked smile. Of course. There was absolutely no chance for Zorian to master all 15 exercises in this particular restart. But that was beside the point. Thanks to the wonder of the time loop. He had far more than a few measly weeks to learn the contents of the book. It was even available in the Academy library. So he didn't have to go to Ilse in the next restart to acquire it. And who knew? Maybe if he learned those he could get Svim to cut him some slack too. A man could dream. Besides, the book was actually fairly interesting. Not only did it explain how to perform each variation in great detail. It also explained the reasons for including each particular exercise. As well as providing a background for understanding why the basic 3 were being taught to students in the first place. Zorian briefly familiarized himself with each of the variations before starting to read earnestly from the start. Making an object glow. Levitating it. Or setting it aflame, these were very simple effects. Requiring only rudimentary shaping skills. The levitation exercise, for instance, was just repelling force emanating from the mage's palm. It doesn't get much simpler than that. There were actually a lot of these simple effects. Certainly more than the 3 they were taught. But these three were deemed a priority. Production of light, heat, or kinetic force were common components of many spells, giving the basic three the sort of general usefulness that most other simple exercises lacked. The variations listed in the book were not in the same category as these simple or starter exercises. Although Svim, Ilse, and the book itself referred to them as variations, Zorian realized they were more like upgrades. Or perhaps advanced versions. He hadn't realized it at the time. But the pen spinning exercise, which was the very first variation outlined in the book, albeit under a fancier name, was a whole other category of difficulty from simply levitating the pen above his palm. Not only did he have to maintain the levitation effect on the pen, he also had to shape an additional effect to make the pen spin. The variation was supposed to teach mages how to multitask, by making them maintain two effects at once. Though Svim would have disagreed, Zorian considered his pen spinning exercise mastered. And the guidelines in the book seemed to agree with him. As such, he started poring over the other four variations of the levitation exercise, trying to figure out which one was the easiest. He quickly realized they were not only arranged in an ascending order of difficulty, but that mastering the later variations probably requires mastering the preceding ones first. Vertical levitation required him to make an object stick to his palm with attractive force, position his palm vertically, and then make the object separate from his palm without falling down. The sticking part was easy, and something Zorian could already do. But making the object float off the palm without falling required that he balances the attractive force binding the object to his palm and the repelling force that made it separate from it. Without the ability to multitask he acquired from the pen spinning exercise, it probably would have taken forever to master this one. Next was fixed position levitation, which required an ability to maintain the levitated object's position in space despite disruptions and changes in initial conditions. In other words, he had to be able to move his hand up and down, left and right, while keeping the levitated object static in space. It required the ability to balance attractive and repelling force he presumably acquired from the vertical levitation exercise. But this time he had to continually adjust the balance in response to changes. And so on. Seeing how there was only one correct order in which these exercises could be learned, Zorian started practicing vertical levitation. Unfortunately, he wouldn't accomplish much in this particular restart. The summer festival was approaching.